Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The whisper of my name floated through the static like a fish through murky water. At first I thought I'd imagined it, just another trick of my exhausted mind after 14 hours at the office. But then it came again, clearer this time, sliding beneath the music in my wireless earbuds, a voice that knew exactly how to pronounce each syllable of my name. And it was getting closer. Night unning had become my salvation 6 months ago. After my promotion to senior project manager at Meridian Tech, the pressure had nearly crushed me. The endless meetings, the impossible deadlines, the constant emails, even during weekends, all of it threatened to consume what little remained of my personal life. My doctor had been blunt: find a stress outlet or prepare for a heart attack before 40. So I started running, and the quiet suburban streets after 10 p.m. became my sanctuary. The route was always the same: down Oakage Drive, past the abandoned community center, through Westfield Park, and back home, 3 miles of solitude with nothing but my playlists to keep me company. I'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of my feet against the pavement, the burn in my lungs, and the blessed emptiness of mind that came around mile 2. No thoughts of upcoming deadlines or performance reviews. Just movement, music, and night air that changed on the third Tuesday of October. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly that evening, leaving a fine mist clinging to the streetlights. Each golden orb was surrounded by a hazy halo, the light diffracted through millions of microscopic water droplets. My breath formed small clouds as I pushed through mile 1, the familiar ache beginning to build in my calves. Florence Plus, the machine, thumped through my earbuds, drowning out the world. The first interruption was so subtle I almost missed it, a brief crackle of static like a radio caught between stations. I adjusted my earbuds without breaking stride, assuming they were just losing their Bluetooth connection. But the music cleared again, and I continued running 3 minutes later as I approached the darkened community center. The music dissolved into a wash of white noise. I slowed my pace, tapping my phone screen to check the connection. That's when I heard it, a whisper beneath the static so faint I had to strain to make it out. Michael. My name spoken with an unsettling familiarity. The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, as if someone were running right beside me, lips almost touching my ear. I yanked out my earbuds and spun around, scanning the empty street behind me. Nothing but shadows and mist. My heart pounded harder than any run had ever caused, the cool air suddenly insufficient for my lungs. I convinced myself it must have been radio interference. The community center had once housed a small local station. Perhaps some equipment was still active, randomly broadcasting on frequencies that my wireless earbuds could pick up a rational explanation. I replaced the earbuds and switched from streaming music to the downloaded playlist on my phone, eliminating any possibility of picking up external signals. The music returned and I resumed running, though at a faster pace than before. The familiar bass line of a Radiohead track helped steady my nerves as I approached the entrance to Westfield Park. The park was poorly lit by design, a concession to the homeowners association's concerns about light pollution. With only every third lamppost illuminated, I'd grown accustomed to navigating the winding path by memory, and the dim pools of light. I was halfway through the park when the music dissolved again. Replaced this time not by static, but by immediate silence. Then the voice returned, no longer a whisper, but a clear, measured tone. Michael, I've been watching you run. The words sent ice water through my veins. I stopped dead in my tracks, my legs suddenly heavy as concrete. Again I removed my earbuds, this time holding them in my open palm. The tiny speakers emitted no sound that I could detect in the open air. I closed all apps on my phone, even restarted it when I cautiously replaced one earbud. There was nothing but silence. Relief washed over me. But it was short-lived as I started jogging again, trying to convince myself it had been a glitch. The voice returned, this time without any electronic mediation. Michael, don't you recognize me? It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the night itself were speaking. I broke into a sprint, my training forgotten, as panic propelled me forward. My lungs burned and sweat poured down my back. Despite the chill in the air, the path ahead stretched into darkness, the distance to the park exit suddenly seeming insurmountable. When I finally burst out of the park onto Maple Street, I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for breath. The residential area was well lit, with porch lights and street lamps creating pools of comforting yellow light. Several houses still had windows, illuminated signs of normal life continuing undisturbed. I glanced back at the park entrance, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the shadows, but there was only darkness and the gentle sway of tree branches in the night breeze. I walked the remaining distance home, my muscles tight with readiness to run again if necessary. The streets were empty except for a cat prowling along a garden wall and an occasional car passing by normal ordinary. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of being watched by something that knew my name and recognized my habits at home. I double-checked all the locks before heading straight to the shower. The hot water couldn't wash away the memory of that voice, nor the creeping sensation along my spine. When I recalled its words, I examined my earbuds, my phone, even my running app settings. Everything appeared normal. No unexplained connections, no unusual activity. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. Sleep had evaded me most of the night, leaving me staring at the ceiling, analyzing every creak and settling noise in my apartment. When exhaustion finally pulled me under, around dawn, my dreams were filled with foggy streets and a voice that chased me through endless darks by afternoon. I'd convinced myself that stress had manufactured the entire experience. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon in cases of extreme fatigue and anxiety. According to the medical websites I'd been browsing, the human brain, when pushed to its limits, could create remarkably convincing sensory experiences. This explanation provided temporary comfort, at least until the sun began to set. As darkness fell, I found myself checking and rechecking the locks, drawing all the blinds, and even placing a chair against my bedroom door, behaviors I would have dismissed as paranoid. Just a day earlier, I knew I wouldn't be running that night. 3 days passed before I attempted running again, and I made several changes to my routine. I chose a different route, one that kept to well-lit main streets I left earlier, while the last traces of sunset still colored the western sky. Most importantly, I ran without earbuds, allowing the ambient sounds of the neighborhood to surround me. The run felt good, therapeutic. Even my confidence returned with each stride, and I mentally rehearsed what I would tell my therapist about the incident. A temporary stress-induced hallucination. Nothing more on day 5. I returned to my original route, though still without earbuds and still before complete darkness. As I passed the community center, I felt a twinge of unease, but pushed through it. The park, however, presented a greater challenge standing at its entrance. I hesitated, staring down the winding path with its inadequate lighting. Several moments passed before I forced myself to enter, maintaining a brisk pace and focusing on my breathing. I was nearing the halfway point when I noticed how unusually quiet the park had become. No distant traffic sounds, no rustle of leaves in the breeze, no night birds, just the sound of my footfalls and breathing. Then, as if triggered by this realization, a familiar sensation crept over me. The feeling of being watched. I accelerated my pace, refusing to look over my shoulder, refusing to acknowledge the prickle of fear crawling up my neck. The path curved ahead, temporarily obscuring the next section from view as I rounded the bend. I collided with something solid that hadn't been there seconds before. Stumbling backward, I found myself facing a figure, standing motionless in the middle of the path. The dim lamplight revealed a man of average height wearing running clothes, similar to my own. His face remained in shadow, but his posture was familiar. Too familiar. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice sounding thin and strained, even to my own ears. The figure tilted its head slightly, regarding me with unseen eyes when it spoke. The voice sent shock waves of recognition through me. "Don't you recognize me, Michael?" It was the same voice from my earbuds, but also it was my voice exactly. My voice with its particular cadence and timbre. The figure stepped forward into the pool of lamplight, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. The face was mine, every feature, every line. The 3-day stubble I hadn't had time to shave, all perfectly reproduced. But the eyes were wrong. They reflected the lamplight in a way human eyes shouldn't. With an amber glow, like an animal caught in headlights, I stumbled backward, unable to process what I was seeing. The doppelganger matched my movement step for step, maintaining our distance. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, though my throat had constricted to the point where speaking was painful. My double smiled, a perfect imitation of my own smile, yet utterly wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. "To run with you, Michael? I've been watching you for so long, learning. You learning how to be you." The implications hit me like a physical blow. How long had this thing been observing me? What did it mean by learning to be me? I turned and ran faster than I ever had before, not caring about proper form or pacing behind me. I heard footsteps matching mine exactly, not pursuing, simply mirroring when I slowed. They slowed when I sprinted. They sprinted, always maintaining the same distance at the park exit. I risked a glance back. The path behind me was empty. The footsteps had stopped. Relief flooded through me as I staggered onto the well-lit street, hands on my knees, as I struggled to catch my breath. That's when my phone buzzed in my pocket, a text message from my own number. "See you tomorrow night, Michael, same route. I'm getting better at being you." I haven't run since that night. My earbuds remain in a drawer untouched. I've requested a transfer to our company's East Coast office, citing personal reasons. Sometimes as I pack my belongings for the move, I catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a figure watching from just outside my window. But when I turn to look directly, there's never anyone there. The moving truck arrives tomorrow. I tell myself that distance will solve the problem, that whatever this thing is must be somehow tied to this location. But late at night, in those vulnerable moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear my phone buzz with notifications from unknown numbers. I never check them anymore. But I know what they say. They're updating me on my running progress, my improving times, my new routes in a city I haven't moved to yet. And sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, I catch myself wondering which of us is really moving away and which of us will be staying behind. The shadows on these rural roads aren't just absences of light. They're presences, watchful and patient. I've driven this route hundreds of times, but that night the darkness felt different, heavier somehow, as if the night itself had grown teeth. I didn't believe in premonitions. Then now I'm not sure what to believe anymore. It was just past midnight when my headlights cut through the fog that had settled over the winding road. Leading to my house, the quarterly budget meeting had dragged on far longer than necessary, leaving me exhausted and irritable. My eyelids felt heavy as I navigated the familiar curves, the radio playing softly to keep me alert. The sparse streetlights along this stretch created islands of sickly yellow illumination amid a sea of darkness, appearing and vanishing with hypnotic regularity. I was only about 2 miles from home when my headlights caught something at the edge of my vision, a figure standing motionless on the shoulder of the road in these parts. It wasn't uncommon to encounter someone needing a ride, especially on nights when the weather turned unfriendly. Still, something about this particular silhouette sent a cold ripple down my spine before I could even consciously process what I was seeing. As I approached, the figure became clearer. A man of average height wearing what looked like a dark overcoat, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. Nothing particularly unusual, except that he wasn't dressed for the weather. No raincoat despite the drizzle that had started to fall. He stood completely still, facing the road as if he'd been waiting specifically for me. I slowed more out of instinct than genuine altruism. My mother had always warned me about stopping for strangers, but this was our community. People looked out for each other here. That's what I told myself as my foot eased toward the brake pedal. The headlights fully illuminated him now, and I could see his face. That's when the wrongness hit me with physical force. Where his eyes should have been, there were only absences, not empty sockets, not closed lids, but shadows that seemed deeper than they had any right to be, as if someone had taken an eraser to that part of his face and left holes in reality itself. The rest of his features were ordinary enough. A straight nose, thin lips, middle-aged. But those eyeshadows made my blood freeze in my veins. My foot jerked from the brake to the accelerator of its own accord. Some primal part of my brain had taken control, triggering a fight-or-flight response so powerful it bypassed conscious thought entirely. A cold sweat broke across my forehead and back, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape as I flew past him. He raised his hand in a small, casual gesture. the universal sign for stop or wait. It was such a normal human movement that it somehow made everything worse in my rearview mirror. I could see him still standing there, perfectly motionless. Once again, his face turned to follow my retreating taillights. He didn't look angry or disappointed. He didn't look anything at all. I didn't take a full breath until I turned into my driveway, hands shaking so badly I struggled to put the car in park. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a trick of the light, or maybe the man had been wearing unusually dark sunglasses at midnight in the rain. My house never felt so secure as it did that night. Yet sleep evaded me. Every creak and settling noise jolted me awake, convinced that something was moving through my home. When I did drift off near dawn, my dreams were filled with dark roads and faceless figures. Morning came with blessed normality. Sunlight streamed through my kitchen window as I made coffee. The night's terror fading into an embarrassing overreaction, I decided to drive past that same spot on my way to work, convincing myself I'd see nothing unusual in the harsh light of day. I was right, there was no sign of the man, with the shadow eyes just an empty stretch of road with tall grass and wildflowers swaying in the morning breeze. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by self-deprecating amusement. I'd let my imagination run wild. That's all. Perhaps I was more tired than I'd realized. For 3 days, life resumed its predictable patterns: work, home, sleep, repeat. I almost managed to forget about the incident entirely until I started noticing small, unsettling changes. First, it was the electricity. Lights would flicker without explanation, especially at night. Then appliances began turning themselves on my TV, switching to static at 3 a.m. The blender whirring to life while I showered. I called an electrician who found nothing wrong with my wiring, suggesting it might be power fluctuations from the grid. Then came the shadows. They seemed to move differently in my peripheral vision, lingering a moment too long after I turned on a light, stretching in directions that defied the positioning of the sun. I'd catch myself staring at the dark corners of rooms, half expecting to see something staring back. My sleep deteriorated further. Each night, I'd jolt awake with the unshakable certainty that someone was standing at the foot of my bed watching me. By the time I fumbled for the lamp switch, there would be nothing there, but the feeling of being observed persisted. About a week after my encounter, I was driving home late again when my headlights began to dim and flicker. The radio, which had been playing quietly, emitted a high-pitched whine. Before dissolving into static, a heavy pressure descended on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort as I rounded the bend where I'd first seen him. My car sputtered and died completely. I sat in the sudden silence, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, aware of how exposed I was on this darkened stretch of road. The logical part of my brain ran through possibilities: alternator failure, dead battery, empty gas tank. But another part, the part that remembered those impossible shadow eyes, screamed danger with trembling hands. I tried the ignition again. Nothing, not even the click of a dead battery. It was as if all electrical systems had simply vacated. My phone showed no service, which was unusual. Even for these rural roads, I was completely cut off. I had two choices: wait in the car until morning or walk the remaining mile and a half home. Neither option appealed to me, but sitting motionless in the dark felt like making myself a target for what I couldn't articulate even to myself. The road stretched before me, bathed in moonlight and mist, beautiful in an ethereal way that did nothing to comfort me. Each step away from my car felt like moving deeper into someone else's territory. The night sounds seemed to recede around me, creating a pocket of silence that followed as I walked. I'd gone perhaps half a mile when I felt it, a subtle change in air pressure. Like the atmosphere itself had become attentive. The hair on my arms and neck rose, and my mouth went dry. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct warned against it. But humans are cursed with curiosity that overrides self-preservation. I looked back. He stood about 30 yards behind me, exactly as before. Average height, dark coat, ordinary in every way, except for those abyssal shadows where eyes should be. He wasn't moving, wasn't approaching, just waiting. My legs nearly buckled with the surge of adrenaline. I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, my breathing shallow and rapid. I didn't look back again, but I knew he was following. Not with footsteps, not with any sound at all. He would simply be there closer each time if I turned around the road ahead, shimmered slightly like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. Though the night was cool as I walked, the distortion grew more pronounced. Something was wrong with the air with reality itself. I rubbed my eyes, but the wavering persisted. That's when I noticed something else. The road wasn't taking me home. I'd been walking for what felt like 20 minutes, and I should have seen my mailbox by now. The large oak tree that marked my property line instead. The road stretched endlessly ahead, identical in every direction. Panic bubbled up my throat. I was lost on a road I'd traveled twice daily for years. Impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. I was somewhere else, somewhere, that looked like my road. But wasn't, or perhaps I was exactly where I should be, and it was the world that had changed around me. A sound finally broke the unnatural silence, a soft footfall behind me. Then another measured, unhurried, deliberate. I ran my dress shoes slapped against the asphalt, my tie flapping over my shoulder, lungs burning with each gasping breath. The mist thickened around me until I could barely see a few feet ahead. Still I ran, even as a certainty grew within me that I was running in circles, or worse, that I was running directly toward what I was trying to escape. The air temperature plummeted suddenly, my exhaled breath clouded before me, and a bone-deep chill penetrated my suit jacket. The mist parted momentarily, and I saw my house ahead, dark and still a sanctuary. If I could reach it, I stumbled up the driveway, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so violently that it took 3 attempts to fit the key in the lock. As the door swung open, I risked one final glance back. The road was empty, relief flooded through me as I slammed and locked the door behind me. Home safe, I leaned against the wall, sliding down until I sat on the floor, waiting for my heartbeat to slow to something approaching normal. That's when I noticed how cold my house was. My breath still formed clouds in the air, and it was dark, completely dark, with none of the small indicator lights from appliances or electronics that usually dotted the rooms. A fresh wave of dread washed over me as I reached for the light switch. I already knew it wouldn't work. The house remained pitch black, but in that moment of attempting to turn on the lights, I became aware of something else. A presence in the darkness, with me not moving, not making a sound, just waiting. My phone screen provided the only illumination as I activated its flashlight function. With trembling fingers, the beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across my familiar living room. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing was there. I advanced slowly through the house, checking each room, telling myself I was being paranoid. The flashlight beam trembled with the shaking of my hand, casting juddering shadows that seemed to move independently of its source in my bedroom. The beam fell upon my dresser, mirror, and there, reflected behind me, stood the figure. Not in the room with me. I spun around to confirm this, heart nearly stopping. But somehow in the mirror behind me, those shadow eyes fixed on my reflection. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The flashlight beam spun crazily across walls and ceiling before settling, illuminating nothing but ordinary bedroom furniture. When I retrieved it and checked the mirror again, it showed only my terrified face for hours. I sat with my back against the bedroom wall, flashlight trained on the mirror, watching, waiting, as dawn approached my phone. Battery died, plunging me back into darkness. I remained motionless, afraid that any movement might attract attention. Morning sunlight eventually filtered through my curtains, revealing a completely normal bedroom. Power was restored, clocks blinking. Needing to be reset outside, my car sat in the driveway. Though I had no memory of driving it home since that night, I've developed routines. I never drive after dark. I've installed the brightest security lights money can buy around my property. I keep flashlights in every room. Sometimes in unguarded moments, I catch glimpses of him reflected in windows, or standing at the periphery of crowded places, always watching with those eyes that aren't eyes, always waiting. I've researched local history, looking for stories of missing persons along that stretch of road, or accidents involving pedestrians. I found nothing concrete, though there are whispered stories among older residents about travelers who took wrong turns and found themselves on roads that shouldn't exist. What was he, a ghost? A hallucination? Something else entirely? I don't know, but I understand now what he was doing on that road. He wasn't seeking a ride to some physical destination. He was looking for a way in. And I'm increasingly certain that on that night, when reality seemed to ripple and shift around me, I inadvertently showed him one sometimes when I look in the mirror. Now my eyes seem darker than they used to be, just a little just around the edges. And in those moments, I feel him watching, not from outside, but from somewhere much closer. Waiting in the first night, I heard the breathing. I convinced myself it was just the old pipe settling. By the third night, I knew better. Something in this house was alive, and it wasn't me. I never wanted to move to Oakage Lane. The neighborhood sat in a depression between two hills where fog settled each evening like a shroud. But the rent was reasonable, and at just 15 minutes from my new job at the tech firm, the location was ideal, a small sacrifice for career advancement. I told myself just a stepping stone a few years here. Then I'd buy something better, something with history that didn't feel wrong. The property manager. Ms. Reeves had seemed oddly eager to have me sign the lease. Looking back, I should have questioned why such an affordable house had remained vacant for months in a neighborhood where properties typically move quickly when I asked about previous tenants. She muttered something about a job relocation and diverted the conversation to the updated kitchen appliances. During the first week, I attributed the strange occurrences to settling into a new place. The misplaced coffee mug I was certain I'd left by the sink appeared on the dining table. The bathroom door I always left open was closed when I returned from work. My glasses relocated from the nightstand to the kitchen counter, all easily explained away by stress and distraction from the new job. Then things escalated. I've always been methodical about certain habits, checking that windows are secure before leaving, turning off lights before bed. So when I returned home to find the guest room window latched shut, despite distinctly remembering cracking it open that morning, to air out the musty smell, a chill crept up my spine. Not forgetfulness, something else. The house itself was unremarkable, a modest 3-bedroom ranch built in the 1800s, early 90s. Nothing about its architecture suggested anything sinister. No Victorian turrets or creaking floorboards from centuries past, just beige walls, laminate countertops, and that persistent smell of dampness I couldn't seem to eliminate. Regardless of how many candles I burned, after 3 weeks, I finally approached the property owner. Mr. Davenport was a thin man with perpetually damp palms who lived across town when I mentioned the oddities I'd been experiencing. His smile tightened at the corners, a nervous tick pulling at his left eye. He claimed such things were common in houses built in 1850. That particular development, something about settling foundations and an underground stream that caused electrical fluctuations. I pressed him about previous tenants having similar experiences, and his response haunts me still. He didn't deny it, only said that some people are more sensitive to their environments than others, before suggesting I invest in a carbon monoxide detector. The conversation ended with his uncomfortable laughter and an assurance that there was nothing to worry about. But there was one Tuesday evening I arrived home after a particularly grueling day at the office. The autumn sun had already set, and the house loomed dark against the night sky. As I approached the front door, key in hand, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A light was on in the guest bedroom, the room where things moved most frequently, where I stored boxes still unpacked and books I hadn't shelved. I hadn't been in that room for days, and I certainly hadn't left any lights on when I departed that morning. My hand trembled as I inserted the key. The rational part of my brain suggested a power surge perhaps, or a timer I'd forgotten setting. But deep down I knew better. Inside the house was silent, except for the persistent hum of the refrigerator. I moved through the living room, down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the laminate flooring. The guest room door stood slightly ajar, yellow light spilling onto the hallway carpet. I pushed it open fully, half expecting to find an intruder. The room was empty. Books I'd stacked neatly against the wall now formed a bizarre, spiraling pattern on the floor. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stepped into the room. The light came from a small desk lamp I didn't recall plugging in. Beside it sat an old leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. I approached cautiously, sweat beading on my forehead. Despite the chill, the journal was weathered, its spine cracked with age. When I opened it, I found page after page of frantic handwriting, the script changing periodically, as though written by different people. The entries described experiences eerily similar to my own objects. Relocating electronics, activating independently the persistent feeling of being watched. The final entry, dated just 6 months earlier, contained 4 words: "It knows I'm leaving that night," marked the beginning of true terror. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the house with that journal, so I drove to a motel and paid for a room with the last of my cash reserves, the next morning blur-eyed and questioning my sanity. I returned, the journal was gone. In its place sat my missing watch, the one I'd been searching for since moving day. I considered moving immediately, but financial reality kept me trapped. The security deposit and first month's rent had depleted my savings, and the new job's first paycheck wouldn't arrive for another week. I was stuck, at least temporarily. I began documenting everything. Took photographs of rooms before leaving for work, only to return to subtle changes. A chair shifted 6 inches to the left. Books rearranged on shelves, my coffee cup moved from the kitchen to the bathroom sink. I installed a basic security camera in the living room, but the footage showed nothing unusual except for occasional static interference around 3:18 a.m. Every night, sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake listening to the house settle or whatever was occurring behind the walls. Sometimes I heard scratching inside the drywall, like rodents skittering between studs, but no exterminator could find evidence of infestation. The worst were the nights I woke to the sound of breathing outside my bedroom door. Not heavy or menacing, but soft, measured, patient, as though someone stood just inches from the wood waiting. My throat would constrict, heart hammering so loudly I was certain whatever stood outside could hear it. The digital clock always showed the same time, 3:18 a.m. During one such episode, paralyzed with fear beneath my sheets, I watched the doorknob turn slowly, metal gleaming in the dim glow of my alarm clock. The door remained locked. I'd taken to securing it with both the regular lock and a rubber door stop, but the deliberate motion of the handle left no doubt something wanted in. I began spending nights elsewhere whenever possible, crashing on a co-worker's couch under the pretense of late-night projects, or claiming my house was being fumigated, but I couldn't escape completely. My financial situation demanded I return eventually one night. Desperate for answers, I forced myself to stay awake until 3:18 a.m. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and waning courage, I positioned myself in the hallway, determined to confront whatever had been terrorizing me, as the digital clock on my phone ticked toward the dreaded time. The temperature plummeted, my breath formed visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. At exactly 3:18, the electricity failed. Total darkness enveloped me, save for the weak beam of my flashlight. The silence was absolute. Not even the refrigerator hummed. Then came the breathing, not from outside my bedroom door this time, but directly behind me. I spun around. Flashlight beam cutting through darkness, illuminating nothing but empty hallway. Yet the breathing continued moving, now circling me. The beam caught something, a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The outline of a figure, transparent but undeniably present. My legs weakened, knees threatening to buckle. I backed toward the front door, never taking my eyes from the shimmer in the air. It followed, maintaining distance, not aggressive, but interested, studying me as I had been studying it. I fumbled with the deadbolt fingers, numb with terror, as the lock clicked open. The presence surged forward. The temperature dropped further, frost crystallized on the walls. My flashlight flickered and died in the pitch darkness. I felt it, a cold pressure against my chest, like fingers pressing directly through skin to clutch at my hammering heart, a whisper directly in my ear. Stay. I bolted through the door and drove aimlessly until dawn, gulping coffee at an all-night diner. While my hands trembled uncontrollably, when morning came, I called in sick to work and visited the county records office instead. The land records revealed nothing unusual about the property. No tragic deaths, no mysterious disappearances. Built in 1992, the house had seen a succession of short-term occupants, none staying longer than 8 months. The property changed hands, frequently sold at increasingly reduced prices. I was about to leave when the clerk mentioned something peculiar. Before the development was built, the land had housed a research facility owned by a now-defunct pharmaceutical company. There were rumors of sleep studies, experimental treatments for parasomnia, and night terrors. Nothing confirmed, just local gossip from decades past. That evening, I returned to the house with a plan. I wouldn't be driven away like the others. Instead of running from the presence, I would acknowledge it. I sat in the center of the living room as darkness fell. No lights, no protection beyond my own resolve. Hours passed in silence at 3:18 a.m. The familiar cold descended. The air shimmered across from me, condensing into that vague human outline. "I know you're here," I said, voice steadier than I felt. "This is your home too, but it's also mine now." The presence remained, breathing audible in the stillness. "I'm not leaving," I continued, "so we need to establish boundaries." The shimmering figure drifted closer. My body screamed to run, but I remained seated, fists clenched against my thighs. "You can stay in the guest room, that's yours. The rest of the house is mine, no. Moving my things, no lights after midnight, no standing outside my door." The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing one moment, uncomfortably warm the next. The shimmer expanded, filling my vision, then contracted to a pinpoint of dense black space. Not absence of light, but absence of everything. I don't know how long we remained in this standoff. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. I woke at dawn, still sitting upright on the living room floor, neck stiff and limbs aching. That was 2 months ago. We've reached an understanding of sorts. The presence and it keeps to the guest room mostly, though I occasionally glimpse that distortion in peripheral vision elsewhere in the house. My possessions remain where I leave them. The lights stay off after midnight. Sometimes I hear it breathing behind the guest room door. I never open it anymore. The strangest development came last week when Mr. Davenport called to check on me. He seemed surprised, almost disappointed to hear I was still living in the house. When I mentioned I'd come to an arrangement with the place, a long silence followed before he muttered something about the house finding another keeper. I don't know what he meant. I don't want to know. I could leave, I suppose, find another apartment, lose my security deposit, stretch my finances to breaking, but something holds me here beyond economic necessity. The presence hasn't shown any malevolence since our agreement, only curiosity, perhaps even loneliness. And lately I've been wondering, when I leave for work each morning, does it watch from the windows, counting the hours until my return? Does it listen for my key in the lock with the same anticipation I once felt coming home to family? I still lock my bedroom door each night, but sometimes in those blurry moments between sleep and waking, I find myself listening for the soft breathing in the hallway, not with fear, but with the comfort of knowing I'm not alone in this house that exhales in perfect rhythm with whatever waits beyond my door. The stain spreads each night. It grows a little more across the fabric of my cap. I've tried everything. Bleach, gasoline, industrial-grade solvents that burn my fingertips raw, but nothing removes it. The discoloration isn't red like blood or black like oil. It's something else entirely, a color that shouldn't exist, that has no name in any language I know. And sometimes when the light hits it just right, I swear it moves, pulsating like something alive, something hungry. It's been 43 days since the accident. That evening began like any other. I was riding my motorcycle back from a late shift, taking the rural highway that cuts through the abandoned lots on the edge of town. Most people avoid that stretch after dark, poor lighting, crumbling asphalt, and a general sense of desolation that makes even rational men uneasy. But it saved me 15 minutes on my commute, and I'd taken it 100 times before without incident. The moon hung heavy in the sky, nearly full, but partially obscured by thin racing clouds. It created an effect like a strobe light, alternating between silver illumination and inky darkness. As I leaned into the curves, the temperature had dropped unexpectedly, and my fingers ached with cold inside my gloves. I remember thinking I should have worn the thermal liner. I never saw what caused the accident. Something in the road, perhaps an animal debris, or just a pothole hidden in shadow. My front wheel caught suddenly, and the bike kicked violently to the right. Years of riding experience triggered an automatic response, but it wasn't enough. The handlebars wrenched from my grip, and I felt that sickening weightlessness as my body separated from the machine. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs. I tumbled across the asphalt, my helmet scraping against the ground with a sound like distant thunder. When I finally stopped rolling, I found myself sprawled at an awkward angle against the curb. My left knee screaming in agony, my motorcycle lay on its side 30 feet away, headlights still blazing but pointed at an empty sky. Pain radiated up my leg in nauseating waves. I attempted to stand but collapsed back to the ground, teeth clenching to suppress a howl. The highway stretched empty in both directions, no cars, no lights, except for my fallen bike and the inadequate street lamp spaced too far apart. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen had shattered in the fall, useless. That's when I felt it, a subtle change in air pressure. The peculiar sensation of no longer being alone. I didn't hear footsteps one moment. There was only me, my damaged bike, and miles of deserted road. And the next, a figure stood at the periphery of my vision, a man in faded jeans and a worn canvas jacket, his face obscured by an old-fashioned cap. Not the modern snapbacks or baseball caps you see everywhere, but one of those vintage flat caps, the kind working men wore in the 1940s. He didn't speak. I called out, asking if he had a phone, but he remained silent. He simply gestured toward me, then extended his hand. His movements were oddly fluid, almost too smooth to be natural. Despite the pain in my knee and the growing unease in my chest, I accepted his help. His grip felt wrong, not cold exactly, but absent of the expected warmth that comes from living flesh. It reminded me of touching the surface of a pond on a windless day. There was substance there, but it yielded in ways that seemed to defy physical laws. The man helped me to my feet and supported my weight as I limped toward my motorcycle. Together we righted the bike and wheeled it to the shoulder. All the while, he never uttered a word, never showed his face clearly. I kept trying to engage him in conversation, asking his name, thanking him, questioning where he'd come from. But he responded only with gestures, a tilt of his head, a wave of his hand. When the bike was secure, he pointed down the highway toward a distant glow, the gas station about a half-mile ahead. I nodded my understanding, and he stepped back, still facing me. But with his features hidden beneath the shadow of his cap, I thanked him again and started to hobble away, using the guardrail for support. After about 50 yards, I turned back to wave, thinking perhaps he was waiting to ensure I could manage the road behind me, stretched empty under the pulsing moonlight. He had vanished as silently as he had appeared. I told myself there must have been a side road I hadn't noticed, or perhaps a path leading into the vacant lot beside the highway. The alternative that he had simply disappeared wasn't something my mind was prepared to accept. It took me nearly 40 minutes to reach the gas station, my knee throbbing with each step. The attendant looked up from his magazine as I pushed through the door, his expression shifting from boredom to concern. He asked what had happened, and I explained about the accident and the silent man who had helped me. The attendant's brow furrowed. He'd been on shift since 6 p.m., he said, and hadn't seen a single person walking along that stretch of road. No cars had stopped and no one wearing an old cap had come by the station. According to him, I was the only person to pass through in the last 3 hours. I might have dismissed his statement. After all, the man could have gone in another direction. But something in the attendant's expression made my skin prickle. He looked at me not with skepticism, but with an unsettling blend of pity and fear. When I pressed him for clarification, he merely shook his head and reached for the phone to call me a tow truck. During the wait, I cleaned up in the restroom, carefully washing the scrapes on my palms and the blood from a small cut above my eye. My cap had survived the crash, relatively intact, a worn canvas thing, not unlike the one mysterious helper had worn. I noticed it had picked up a strange stain near the brim, a discoloration I couldn't quite place. Not blood, which would have been dark red, and not oil, which would have been black. This was something else, something that seemed to shift color depending on how the fluorescent light hit it. I assumed it was just dirt from the roadside and stuffed the cap in my jacket pocket. The tow truck arrived an hour later. The driver helped me load my damaged motorcycle, and I rode in the cabin back to my apartment complex, my mind replaying the strange encounter over and over. By the time I crawled into bed that night, exhaustion had overtaken my unease, and I dismissed the entire experience as shock and adrenaline, playing tricks on my perception that should have been the end of it. 3 days later, I noticed the stain on my cap had grown. What had been a small discoloration near the brim now spread across nearly an inch of fabric, and it had changed somehow, deeper, more vibrant, with edges that seemed to pulse slightly when viewed from the corner of my eye. I tossed the cap into the washing machine with my other laundry, using extra detergent for good measure. When I retrieved it later, the stain remained unchanged, impervious to the industrial strength cleaner. Over the following weeks, I tried everything to remove it. Specialized stain removers, bleach, even gasoline, but nothing worked. And all the while it continued to spread, advancing across the fabric like an infection. Dreams came next, vivid nightmares that left me gasping awake in sweat. Soaked sheets, always the same sequence. I'm riding my motorcycle down that empty highway, but the road stretches endlessly before me. The moon pulses overhead, growing larger with each flash until it fills the entire sky with sickly light. And always in my rearview mirror, a figure follows, walking at first, then running with impossible speed, wearing that old-fashioned cap pulled low over features I can never quite see. I wake just as he reaches for me. The dreams might have been manageable if they had remained confined to sleep, but soon I began experiencing moments of discontinuity during my waking hours. Brief flashes where reality seemed to stutter like frames missing from a film reel. The first incident occurred while I was shopping for groceries. One moment, I was selecting apples, and the next I found myself in the parking lot with a cart full of items I didn't remember choosing. 20 minutes had vanished, erased from my memory. These episodes increased in frequency and duration. Sometimes I'd wake up in strange locations, a park bench across town, the lobby of a hotel I'd never visited once, even standing before the guardrail at the exact spot of my accident, with no recollection of how I'd gotten there. More disturbing were the changes to my apartment. Objects moved between blackouts. Nothing dramatic, just subtle rearrangements that might be attributed to forgetfulness. A coffee mug on the wrong shelf, books facing spine inward on the bookcase, my motorcycle keys in the refrigerator, and always the cap with its growing stain prominently displayed wherever I returned to consciousness on the kitchen counter. The bathroom sink once directly in the center of my pillow. No matter how many times I buried it at the bottom of the trash or stuffed it into distant corners of closets, it reappeared. I sought medical help, describing the blackouts and disorientation while carefully omitting the more inexplicable elements of my experience. The doctor ordered tests and MRI, blood work, neurological examinations, but found nothing physically wrong. He suggested the accident might have caused a mild traumatic brain injury, too subtle to appear on scans, and prescribed rest and follow-up appointments. The medication he gave me for anxiety did nothing to stop the blackouts or the dreams. My research into the area where the accident occurred yielded little of use. The vacant lot had once been a small factory, producing machine parts demolished in the 1970s after a fire. Nothing in its history suggested tragedy or violence. No deaths, no disappearances, nothing that would seed the ground for the kind of haunting I was experiencing. If it was a haunting at all, increasingly, I questioned my own perception, my own sanity. Perhaps the silent man had never existed. Perhaps I had imagined him in the confusion and pain following the crash. Perhaps the stain was simply something my damaged mind had fixated on, imbuing an ordinary object with supernatural significance. But then came the photographs. I hadn't taken them. At least not consciously. They appeared on my phone one morning after a particularly severe blackout that had left me waking up in my bathtub, fully clothed and shivering under cold water. I had no memory of running. The images showed my empty apartment from various angles, as if someone had methodically documented every room, except in each photo, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a dark blur. The suggestion of a figure just stepping out of view, and in the final image, a close-up of my nightstand, sat the cap with its spreading stain, now covering nearly half the fabric with that impossible shifting color, written in condensation on my bathroom mirror that same morning, in handwriting that was almost but not quite my own. He helps until he doesn't. Last night, I returned to the site of the accident, not during a blackout, but deliberately driving my car slowly along that stretch of highway. Just after midnight, the road was as empty as it had been that night. The moon again playing hide and seek with racing clouds. I parked on the shoulder near where I had fallen and stepped out into the cool night air. The vacant lot stretched away into darkness, tall weeds swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. I stood motionless, waiting though, for what? I couldn't have said. Minutes passed, nothing happened. No silent figure emerged from the shadows. No answers presented themselves. Just as I turned to leave my headlights, illuminated something in the weeds, several yards from the roadside, a flash of faded blue fabric. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached my flashlight beam, dancing erratically with the trembling of my hand. There, half buried in the dirt in overgrowth, lay an old-fashioned cap, identical to the one worn by mysterious helper, and identical to my own. It bore a stain spread across its surface. The same indefinable color that now covered most of my cap at home. But this stain had expanded further, consuming the entire fabric until the original color was merely a memory. I didn't touch it somehow. I knew that would be crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Instead, I backed away, returned to my car, and drove home in a state of numb dissociation. My cap was waiting on my pillow when I arrived. Its stain now expanded dramatically since morning. Only a small portion of the original fabric remained visible around the edges. I understand now. The man who helped me that night wasn't a good Samaritan. He wasn't even a man. He was something else, something that has attached itself to me through that inexplicable stain, something that grows stronger with each passing day, each blackout, each moment of lost time. He helps until he doesn't. And soon, very soon, the stain will completed, spread across my cap. I don't know what happens then, but I feel him watching from just behind my eyes, waiting with impossible patience sometimes when I catch my reflection. Unexpectedly, I see him there. My face, but not my face, wearing that old-fashioned cap pulled low. And I understand now why he never spoke, why his grip felt so wrong, why he disappeared so completely that night. I understand what's coming. The stain spreads each night. It grows a little more tomorrow. I think it will be complete. The shadows in this building don't behave like normal shadows. They stretch when they shouldn't contract, when the light demands expansion. And sometimes, I swear, they move independently of their owners. I noticed this on my third day working here, but dismissed it as sleep deprivation or the quirks of outdated fluorescent lighting, now 3 months into my new position at Meridian Consulting. I understand these aberrations were warnings, the building's way of communicating that it harbors something ancient and restless beneath its corporate veneer. The Meridian Tower stands isolated among a cluster of half-empty office buildings in what was once the city's thriving business district. Economic downturns transformed this area into a ghost town of concrete and glass. My relocation here came with a substantial salary increase enough to overcome my initial hesitation about the commute to this desolate zone. The building itself is an architectural relic from the 1970s, 16 floors of brutalist design, with narrow windows and a facade of weathered concrete that appears almost porous in certain lights, as if the building itself were breathing. My department occupies the 8th floor by department. I mean myself and 3 colleagues who I rarely see. The company operates on a flexible schedule system, and most employees choose to work remotely. I prefer the structure of an office environment. Despite the eerie emptiness of our floor, my office sits at the end of the eastern corridor, offering a view of abandoned construction projects and the distant skyline. The fluorescent lights flicker occasionally, and the ventilation system produces a constant, whispering hum that becomes white noise after a few hours. The first incident occurred 3 weeks ago. I had stayed late to finish the quarterly financial projections, routine work that demanded focus rather than creativity. Around 8:30 p.m., I noticed a rhythmic flickering from the hallway. The light on the opposite end of the corridor pulsated in an unnatural pattern. 3 quick flashes, followed by 2 longer ones. Then darkness for 10 seconds before repeating. The security guard had left at 7, and I believed myself to be alone on the floor. My heartbeat quickened as I approached the disturbance. Each step on the thin carpet seemed to produce an echo that shouldn't have been possible in a space with acoustic ceiling tiles. The air grew noticeably colder as I neared the source of the flickering. I called out, asking if maintenance was working, but my voice sounded muffled, as if the air itself were absorbing the sound waves. When I reached the light switch, the flickering stopped abruptly, the panel showed no signs of tampering, and a quick inspection revealed no one hiding in the nearby offices. I convinced myself it was an electrical issue, made a mental note to email facilities management, and returned to my desk. I put on my noise-canceling headphones to silence the building's constant mechanical murmuring and resumed my work. The spreadsheet demanded my full attention, and I lost myself in the rhythm of data entry and analysis. 20 minutes later, the volume in my headphones surged from background music to a deafening roar. Pain shot through my ears as the sound amplified beyond what the equipment should have been capable of producing. I yanked the headphones off my hands, trembling, expecting to see smoke or some sign of malfunction. The volume indicator on my computer showed no change. It remained at 40%. I quickly shut down the system, but the headphones now resting on my desk continued to emit a high-pitched wail, audible even without wearing them. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I stared at the disconnected headphones, still producing sound. When I finally gathered the courage to touch them again, I pulled the cable from the jack, and the noise ceased instantly. The abrupt silence felt more oppressive than the mechanical whine of the building. I packed my belongings with shaking hands and left immediately, telling myself that electromagnetic interference or a power surge had caused the malfunction. But as the elevator descended, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed not by cameras or people, but by the building itself, as if it had tested me, and I had fled the following days, passed without incident, and I began to rationalize what had happened. Old buildings have quirks, electrical systems deteriorate, equipment fails. These explanations seemed sufficient in daylight, surrounded by colleagues in the mundane activities of office life. But each day, as the sun began its descent, I found myself watching the clock, making excuses to leave before darkness fully claimed the cityscape. Last week, deadline pressures forced me to work late again by 7:30 p.m. I was alone on the 8th floor. The cleaning staff having completed their rounds an hour earlier, I had deliberately avoided using my headphones instead, working in the building's ambient silence. The occasional distant ping of an elevator or the settling creak of the structure provided the only interruptions to my concentration at 8:27 p.m. I remember checking my watch. The temperature in my office dropped dramatically. My breath fogged in the air, and my fingers grew stiff with cold. The building's climate control system showed no changes, maintaining its steady 72 degrees, according to the thermostat. I put on my jacket and continued working, attributing the chill to poor air circulation in the aging structure. The computer screen flickered, displaying momentary distortions that resembled faces, gaunt, elongated visages with hollow eyes that appeared for milliseconds before dissolving back into spreadsheet cells and graphs. I blinked hard, pressed my palms against my eyes, and took several deep breaths. When I looked again, the screen displayed only my work, but the image of those faces remained burned in my mental periphery. The desk phone rang its shrill tone, shattering the silence. My hand hovered over the receiver as dread pulled in my stomach. According to the display, the call originated from extension 842, an office down the hall that I knew to be vacant. After 4 rings, the call transferred to voicemail. The message light remained dark, no recording. I gathered my courage and stepped into the hallway, determined to investigate the empty office. The corridor stretched before me, seemingly longer than during daylight hours. The overhead lights created pools of sickly yellow illumination, with deepening shadows between them. I moved slowly, hyper-aware of every sound. The soft pad of my shoes on carpet, the quickening rhythm of my breathing, the thunderous pounding of my hard office. 842 stood with its door slightly ajar, darkness spilling from the opening like liquid. I pushed the door wider, fumbling for the light switch. The fluorescence buzzed reluctantly to life, revealing a standard office setup desk, ergonomic chair, filing cabinet, and computer. Everything coated with a fine layer of dust except for the phone, which gleamed as if recently polished. I approached it cautiously, noting that its message light was blinking steadily. One new message received, my finger hovered over the playback button. The rational part of my brain argued that a technical glitch had triggered an automated call, that there would be nothing but static or silence on the recording. But deeper instincts screamed warnings, raising the hair on my arms and the back of my neck. Before I could decide, the message played automatically, filling the room with the sound of breathing, not the regular pattern of a living person, but a labored, wet rattling that seemed to emanate from damaged lungs. I backed toward the door, my legs threatening to buckle beneath me. The breathing on the recording accelerated, matching my own panicked gasps. Then came words distorted and stretched but unmistakable. "You belong to the building, now the lights extinguish themselves," plunging me into absolute darkness. I turned to flee, but my sense of direction betrayed me. The doorway had vanished, or perhaps I had become disoriented in my panic. My outstretched hands encountered only wall, where the exit should have been. I moved laterally, fingers scrabbling against the surface, searching desperately for the frame of the door. The breathing from the recording continued now, seeming to come from directly behind me, rather than the phone. A cold pressure settled between my shoulder blades, like a hand made of ice pressing through my jacket and shirt to touch my skin. My muscles locked in terror as it trailed upward to the nape of my neck. The building's fire alarm activated without warning, the strobe effect of emergency lights revealing the room in fractured freeze frames. The exit appeared before me and I lunged through it, stumbling into the hallway where other alarms blared in synchronized chaos. Employees from the few occupied offices emerged, looking confused and irritated by the disruption. None showed signs of having experienced anything unusual beyond the inconvenience of an evacuation outside standing amid a scattered group of annoyed coworkers in the building's plaza. I gazed up at the 8th floor in the window of office. 8 to 42, a silhouette stood watching, a figure composed more of absence than substance. A void in human shape that seemed to absorb the emergency lights rather than reflect them. I called in sick the following day, and the day after, when I finally returned, I requested an office reassignment, citing poor ventilation affecting my asthma. My manager seemed understanding, even mentioning that my predecessor had made similar complaints. The company relocated me to the 6th floor in a corner office with windows on 2 sides and better lighting. The space feels safer, more exposed to natural light and the activities of colleagues. But sometimes in the reflection of my monitor when the screen dims, I see that office on the 8th floor. And sometimes when I work past sunset, I hear the elevator stop on 8. Although I've pressed 6, the door is opening to reveal an empty corridor illuminated by pulsating light. 3 quick flashes, 2 longer ones, then darkness. Yesterday, my new headphones arrived, wireless models that connect via Bluetooth rather than cables. I wore them during my commute this morning, and they performed flawlessly. But now as twilight gathers outside my window, I notice the battery indicator dropping rapidly despite being fully charged an hour ago. And though I've set the volume at a comfortable level, the sound seems to be intensifying incrementally. With each passing minute, the building knows I'm still here. And night is falling. The human mind is remarkably adept at rationalization. We explain away the inexplicable, dismiss the impossible, and rewrite our memories to maintain sanity. I used to be like that, logical, skeptical, grounded. But that was before the call, before the voice that knew my name started reaching through the darkness, leaving traces of its existence that vanished like morning dew under scrutiny. Now I understand that some things exist in the liminal spaces between what we can prove and what we can perceive. And they're watching, always watching. I've always been particular about my nighttime routine. My apartment isn't large, but it's mine. A 1-bedroom sanctuary on the 3rd floor of an older building. Downtown, the bedroom walls are painted a calming slate blue, and the hardwood floors creak reassuringly. When I pace during late-night insomnia episodes every night before bed, I'd plug my phone in at the small desk in the living room, deliberately placing it beyond arms. Reach the soft blue glow of notifications had disrupted my sleep once too often, and separation from my digital tether had become necessary self-care. This simple habit had served me well for months until that Saturday in late October. The night had been unremarkable. I had spent the evening alone reviewing architectural plans for Monday's client meeting. Nursing a glass of bourbon as rain pelted against my windows, the weather forecast had predicted a storm system moving through, and the wind whistled through the building's old framework like a distant, mournful song. I remember checking my phone one last time around midnight. No messages, no missed calls, battery at 38%. I plugged it in at my desk, switched off the lights, and settled into bed, falling asleep to the rhythm of rain against glass. The ringing jolted me awake. At first, I wasn't sure what I was hearing. My mind was thick with sleep, my thoughts sluggish and confused. The soft blue glow of my digital clock read 3:17 a.m. The ringing continued, muffled and distant, as though coming from underwater or behind a wall. It took several seconds for my brain to process that it was my phone, and several more to realize it shouldn't be ringing. At this hour, I stumbled out of bed disoriented, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The apartment was pitch black except for a sliver of streetlight filtering through my bedroom curtains, casting long shadows that seemed to move with each flash of lightning outside. The ringing continued as I made my way toward the living room, my hand trailing along the wall for guidance. Something felt wrong. The ringing didn't sound right. It was my ringtone, yes, but distorted somehow, as if playing through damaged speakers or from beneath a heavy blanket. The sound seemed to shift direction as I moved, first coming from the desk where I'd left my phone, then seemingly from behind me. Then from the kitchen, I blamed my sleep brain and the acoustics of my apartment. But a cold sweat had begun to beat on my forehead. Despite the autumn chill, when I finally reached my desk, the phone screen illuminated a small circle of the room, casting harsh shadows across my architectural drawings. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number with my area code. The time on the screen confirmed it was 3:18 a.m. No one calls at this hour with good news. I hesitated, watching it ring 3 more times before finally answering with a cautious hello. Silence greeted me, but not complete silence. There was a soft, staticky hiss, the sound of an open line without a speaker. I repeated my hello louder this time, my voice sounding foreign and tense in the darkened room. Nothing, just that persistent, gentle static, like the sound of distant rainfall or someone breathing very softly into the receiver. I waited, listening to the nothingness for nearly a minute before deciding it must be a misdial or a system error. I ended the call, placed the phone back on the charger, and returned to bed. Though sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night, every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the windows seemed amplified, intentional. Watching morning arrived with watery sunlight breaking through cloud cover. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected a pale blue sky. I rose, feeling unrested, the night's disturbance lingering like a bad aftertaste over coffee. I scrolled through my phone, intending to block the number that had called. That's when I noticed something odd. There was no record of any incoming call in my call history. Instead, there was a notification I hadn't seen before: one new voicemail received at 3:17 a.m. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. I stared at the notification, trying to reconcile what I knew had happened with what my phone was telling me. I had answered that call. I had heard the static. There should be a record of it, but instead there was only this voicemail from a call I had no memory of receiving or missing, with a sense of growing unease. I pressed play on the voicemail and held the phone to my ear for several seconds. There was nothing but that same static I'd heard when answering the phone. Then, emerging from the white noise, like a figure appearing through heavy fog, came a voice. It was distorted, pitched too low to be natural, with a metallic quality that made it sound almost mechanical. But despite the distortion, I could clearly hear it speak my name, not my nickname or shortened form, but my full formal name that few people used. The voice repeated it 3 times, each utterance more drawn out than the last, elongating the vowels until my name was barely recognizable. Then the voice began to speak again in what sounded like sentences, but the words were unintelligible, either in a language I didn't recognize, or so heavily distorted that English became unrecognizable. Beneath the voice was a rhythmic metallic scraping, like a blade being drawn slowly across a metal surface. The message continued for 47 seconds before cutting off abruptly mid-syllable, as if the speaker had been interrupted. My hands were trembling by the time the message ended. I played it again, straining to make sense of the garbled speech, but could discern nothing beyond my name. I checked the number. It matched the one I'd seen on my screen at 3:17 a.m., but when I tried to call it back, an automated voice informed me that the number was not in service. A quick internet search revealed nothing. The number wasn't associated with any business or listed in any directory I could find. I tried to approach the situation rationally. It was probably just an elaborate brew call, a new type of scam. The distortion could be a technical glitch, and perhaps they had my name from some data breach. The absence of the call in my history might be due to my half-awake state. Maybe I had dreamed answering the phone and had actually slept through the call, which went to voicemail. These explanations felt flimsy even as I formulated them, but they were preferable to the alternative that something inexplicable had occurred. Sunday passed in a haze of unease. I found myself checking my phone compulsively, both dreading and anticipating another call. None came. I spent hours researching obscure phone scams and voice distortion techniques, trying to find something that matched my experience. My searches yielded nothing conclusive. That night I broke my routine and kept my phone on my bedside table. Both as a challenge to whatever had happened and out of a strange fear of having it out of reach, I slept poorly, waking at the slightest sound. But no call came Monday, brought the distraction of work client meetings and colleagues who knew nothing of my disturbed weekend. I began to distance myself from the experience, compartmentalizing it as an unsolved but ultimately insignificant mystery. By Wednesday, I had almost convinced myself it had been nothing more than a bizarre technical glitch, combined with my own sleep-deprived imagination. Almost it was Thursday night when things escalated. I was working late at home, sprawled on my couch with blueprints scattered around me and my phone resting on the coffee table at precisely 10:46 p.m. My phone screen lit up with an incoming text message. The number was different from the one that had called, but similarly unfamiliar. The message contained a single word: listening. A chill ran through me. I stared at the message, trying to determine if it could be spam or a message sent to the wrong number. As I was debating whether to respond, a second text arrived from the same number, 317. My mouth went dry. My heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my fingertips as they hovered over the screen. This couldn't be a coincidence before I could decide what to do. A third message appeared. Soon I immediately tried to call the number back. It rang once before connecting to nothing. No voicemail, no automated message. Just that same staticky silence I had heard on Sunday morning. I hung up and blocked the number, then sat in my suddenly too quiet apartment, listening to the sound of my own rapid breathing. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound from the street below or the neighboring apartments around 2:30 a.m. I noticed my phone's battery was getting low, despite having been charged all evening. As I watched, the battery percentage dropped rapidly from 42% to 36% to 29%, as if something was actively draining it. I plugged it in, but the battery continued to deplete despite being connected to power. By 3:08 a.m., it was down to 17% at 3:16 a.m. My fully charged wireless earbuds, which were sitting in their case on the coffee table, suddenly connected to my phone. Without me touching them, the notification appeared on my screen. AirPods connected. A second later, my phone screen went completely black, despite still being plugged in my throat, constricted with panic. The room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face, though it was a mild autumn night and my heating was functioning normally. The hair on my arm stood on end, and a sensation like static electricity prickled across my skin. At exactly 3:17 a.m., a voice came through my connected earbuds. It was the same distorted metallic voice from the voicemail, but clearer now, as if whoever or whatever was speaking had moved closer to the microphone. It spoke my name again, followed by an address. My address. Then it described in precise detail where I was sitting in my apartment at that very moment, what I was wearing, and the expression on my face. I ripped the earbuds out, my hands shaking violently, but the voice continued, now coming directly from my phone's speakers. Despite the black screen, the voice described how long I had lived in the apartment where I worked my daily routines. It knew things no stranger could know, the recurring nightmare I'd had since childhood. The name of my first pet, the words I had whispered to my mother at her hospital bedside when no one else was in the room with each new revelation. The metallic scraping in the background grew louder, more frantic, like dozens of knives being sharpened simultaneously. Then the voice changed tone, becoming almost conversational despite its inhuman quality. It told me it had been watching me for a long time, always listening, always present in the background of my life. It said it had finally found a way to reach through to make contact. It said this was only the beginning. At 3:23 a.m., my phone screen suddenly illuminated again, showing dozens of rapid-fire incoming text messages, all from different numbers, all containing the same phrase repeated over and over. "See you soon." I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my car keys and fled the apartment, driving aimlessly through empty streets until sunrise. When I returned cautiously, everything was normal. My phone functioned perfectly with no evidence of the text, the call, or the battery drain. The only lingering evidence was the original voicemail still saved in my inbox, and my own fractured sense of reality that was 2 weeks ago. I've since changed my phone number, my email addresses, even my apartment. I've consulted with tech experts who found no malware on my devices, no evidence of hacking. One particularly thorough security specialist told me with professional certainty that what I described was technologically impossible. Yet every night at 3:17 a.m., no matter where I am or what precautions I take, something electronic near me activates. Sometimes it's subtle, a digital watch briefly displaying the wrong time, a nearby TV momentarily losing signal, a car alarm chirping once for no reason. Other times it's more direct, a random number texting me a single word, always different but always ominous. Closer patience. Remember, I've stopped trying to explain it to others. I've stopped trying to fight it. Now I just wait, watching the clock each night as 3:17 a.m. approaches, wondering when the voice will tire of these games and finally reveal what it wants from me. Because one thing has become increasingly clear: whatever is reaching out through my devices isn't trying to harm me. At least not physically. It's trying to communicate something specific, something it believes I need to understand, sometimes in my more rational moments. I wonder if this is all an elaborate breakdown, if stress and isolation have fractured my perception of reality. But then I remember the voice speaking facts. No one could know secrets I've never shared. And I remember the one part of the distorted message I finally deciphered after listening to it hundreds of times. You open the door, you can't close it now. I don't know what door it means. I don't know what's coming through, but I know it's getting closer. And I know that soon, very soon, I won't need a phone to hear it anymore. The glass doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the whole truth either. That's what I keep telling myself as I stand frozen in my kitchen at 3:17 a.m., staring at a reflection that shouldn't exist. The silhouette behind me is taller than I am, with shoulders that hunch forward at an unnatural angle. I haven't turned around yet. I can't, because deep down I know that when I do, I'll see nothing but the empty hallway, and that terrifies me more than whatever is watching me from inside the glass. My ground-floor apartment had seemed like a steal 6 months ago. Newly renovated kitchen, decent square footage for the price, and a private entrance through a sliding glass door that opened to a small patio surrounded by neglected shrubs, the property manager had called it. Garden access. Now I understand why the previous tenant left so abruptly, breaking their lease without even collecting their security deposit. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago, a routine midnight trip to the kitchen for water before bed. The overhead light was off. I know my way around well enough and didn't want the harsh fluorescence to fully wake me. The kitchen was lit only by the dim glow of the digital clock on the microwave, and whatever ambient light filtered in from the street lamps outside. I filled my glass at the sink, and as I turned to head back to bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the glass door, a dark shape where there shouldn't have been one, hovering just behind my left shoulder. My body responded before my mind could process what I was seeing. Heart lurching into my throat, I spun around, sloshing water onto the linoleum. Nothing. The hallway stretched empty and dark behind me. I stood motionless, water dripping from my fingers, ears straining for any sound. Besides my own shallow breathing, after a full minute of silence, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, or perhaps my own drowsy brain manufacturing images in the darkness. But when I turned back toward the glass door, it was there again. Not directly behind me anymore, but standing slightly to the side, as if it had moved while I was looking away. This time I could make out more details, the vague outline of a head, the curve of hunched shoulders, arms that hung too long and too still at its sides. It didn't appear solid, more like a smudge of deeper darkness against the shadows reflected in the glass. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, squinted at the reflection. The shape remained unmoving now when I raised my hand. It didn't mirror my movement. When I took a step forward, it stayed in place only when I finally gathered the courage to whirl around again. Did it disappear? And only from my direct view, I knew somehow that if I turned back to the glass, it would still be there watching. I left the water glass on the counter and retreated to my bedroom that night, double-checking the lock on my door before huddling under the covers like a child. Sleep came eventually, but it was thin and troubled, filled with dreams of standing in front of mirrors that reflected someone else's movements. The following morning, under the harsh light of day, I almost managed to convince myself I'd imagined it all. Sleep deprivation from too many late nights at the office, stress from the upcoming performance review, perhaps even the beginning of a migraine. There were plenty of rational explanations. I went about my day deliberately pushing the incident from my mind. That evening, I installed brighter bulbs in the kitchen light fixtures and made a point of keeping them on whenever I entered the room after sunset for 3 days. This strategy worked. The increased illumination eliminated most of the reflective quality of the glass door, and I could fetch my evening water without incident. I began to relax, to believe the whole thing had been nothing more than an isolated episode, a quirk of an exhausted mind. Then the power went out. A brief summer storm had knocked out electricity to several blocks in my neighborhood. Nothing serious. The property manager assured all tenants via text that it would likely be restored by morning. I found my flashlight, set out some candles, and settled in for an early night around midnight. Thirst drove me from my bed to the kitchen. The beam of my flashlight cast elongated shadows that danced across the walls as I moved. The kitchen was eerily silent, without the usual hum of the refrigerator. I filled my glass by flashlight, then set the light on the counter, pointing upward to create ambient illumination while I drank. That's when I felt a distinct drop in temperature, as if someone had opened a freezer door behind me. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and my breath fogged slightly in front of my face. Slowly, reluctantly, my gaze moved to the glass door. It was there, clearer than before. The diffused glow of the flashlight created the perfect conditions for the door to become a mirror, and what it reflected chilled me more thoroughly than the sudden, cold snap. The figure stood directly behind me now, close enough that I should have felt its breath on my neck. Its form was still indistinct, like a person shaped from smoke or ink and water. But I could now make out what might have been facial features, hollow depressions where eyes should be a gash-like opening in place of a mouth. As I watched frozen in place, its head tilted slightly, as if in curiosity. One elongated arm began to rise. Reaching toward my shoulder, I could see the movement clearly in the reflection, could track the approach of those impossibly long fingers, but felt nothing on my skin. My lungs burned before I realized I'd been holding my breath when I finally gasped for air. The sound was explosively loud in the silent apartment. I spun around, flashlight already raised as a makeshift weapon. Nothing, empty air greeted me. The temperature had already normalized, my breath no longer visible. I swept the flashlight beam across every corner of the kitchen and adjacent hallway, finding nothing out of the ordinary. But I couldn't shake the certainty that something had almost touched me, or tried to. I avoided the kitchen for the rest of that night, ignoring my parched throat until morning brought both sunlight and restored electricity at work. I researched the history of my apartment building, looking for any tragedies or unusual events that might explain what I was experiencing. The structure was relatively new, only 15 years old, built on what had previously been an empty lot. No reported deaths, no notorious incidents. Nothing that would account for a haunting, if that's what this was. I considered the possibility that I was experiencing some sort of neurological event. Hallucinations could be symptoms of serious conditions, but the phenomenon seemed too specific, too localized to that one reflective surface. I could look in my bathroom mirror without incident. The stainless steel of my refrigerator door reflected normally. It was only the glass patio door that showed me things that shouldn't be there that night. I conducted an experiment. I set up my phone to record video of the kitchen. While I stood in front of the glass door, the resulting footage showed only me alone staring tensely at my reflection. But I had seen it again just as clearly as before. The dark figure standing behind me, this time, with what looked like one hand raised to its distorted mouth, as if signaling for silence after a week of increasing encounters. I developed a system, kitchen lights always on at night, quick in and out. No lingering, never looked directly at the glass door. If it could be avoided, I rearranged my furniture so I could approach the sink from an angle that minimized exposure to the reflection, When I absolutely had to face that direction, I kept my eyes unfocused, looking through rather than at the glass. But avoidance strategies can only work for so long. The figure grew bolder, appearing earlier in the evening, remaining visible even with the lights on, though more transparent. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of it from the corner of my eye while cooking dinner. Other times I'd feel that distinctive temperature drop while sitting on my couch, only to look up and see it watching me from the reflection in the TV screen. When it was turned off last night, things escalated. I woke suddenly at 2 a.m., my mouth desert dry, heart pounding from a nightmare. I couldn't remember the need for water was overwhelming. I stumbled to the kitchen, flicked on the light, and froze. The glass door was covered in condensation from the inside, as if someone had been breathing on it. In the foggy surface, a finger had traced 3 words: "Not your reflection." My rational mind scrambled for explanations, temperature differences between inside and outside condensation patterns, forming coincidental shapes, my own subconscious interpreting random marks as words. But I knew what I had seen before. I could think better of it. I approached the door and wiped my hand across the glass, erasing the message. The surface was bone dry. I backed away, bumping into the kitchen counter hard enough to send a mug crashing to the floor. The sound shattered the midnight silence, and in that moment of distraction, I glanced at the glass door again. The figure was there, more substantial than ever before. No longer just a silhouette. It now had definition. The suggestion of clothing, a face still shrouded in shadow but unmistakably turned toward me. Worst of all, it was no longer mimicking my position. While I stood pressed against the counter, it was moving toward the glass from the other side, one hand raised, fingertips pressing against the barrier between us. I watched paralyzed as frost began to form around those points of contact, delicate crystalline patterns spreading outward across the glass. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted so rapidly that I heard the distinct ping of glassware contracting in the cabinets. My exhaled breath billowed in front of me like smoke. Something in me finally broke. I lunged for the light switch, plunging the kitchen into darkness, then stumbled blindly back to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. I huddled under my blankets until dawn, listening to the soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to travel from the kitchen down the hall to stop just outside my bedroom door. This morning, I called in sick to work and contacted a real estate agent. I told her I needed to sublet my apartment immediately, making up a story about a job opportunity in another state. She asked about the lease termination fees. I told her they didn't matter. Tonight is my last night here. The new tenant moves in tomorrow afternoon. I didn't tell her about the glass door or what I've seen in it. Perhaps it's something specific to me, some projection of my own psyche that won't affect her at all. Or perhaps she'll never notice. We'll keep the blinds drawn. And the lights bright and never have reason to see what waits in the reflection. It's nearly midnight now. I've packed everything except a mattress and the clothes I'll wear tomorrow. My throat is dry from moving boxes all day, but I've been holding a bottle of water close, taking small sips to avoid any need to return to the kitchen. I should sleep in less than 12 hours. This will all be behind me, but there's a part of me that needs to know a part that won't let me leave without understanding what has been watching me all these weeks. So here I stand one last time in front of the glass door. The kitchen lights are off. The only illumination comes from my phone's flashlight, propped on the counter to cast just enough glow to create reflections. The figure is already there, has been waiting for me. It seems more solid tonight, less a shadow and more a presence. We face each other. Me in the kitchen, it in whatever space exists inside or beyond the glass. I raise my hand. It mirrors me, raising its own. I step closer. It does the same. For the first time, I speak to it directly, asking what it wants from me. The reflection's mouth moves, but I hear nothing instead. Frost begins to form on the glass again, patterns swirling into letters, then words to switch places as understanding dawn. I notice something I've been too frightened to see before. The figure isn't some supernatural entity or ghost. The face taking shape in the glass, it's my own but wrong, somehow eyes too. Hollow smile too wide, posture too hunched. I've been looking at myself all along, but not my reflection, my replacement. I back away from the door, shaking my head. The figure, my distorted, double presses both hands against the glass, now leaving spreading frost in the shape of palms and fingers. The barrier between us seems thinner than ever, vibrating slightly like a membrane about to rupture. I should run. I know I should run instead. I find myself wondering, how long has it been watching? Has it always been there, waiting for me to notice? And what happens if one night I turn around quickly enough to catch it outside the reflection? I won't find out tonight. I grab my keys and phone, leaving everything else behind. The motel 6 miles away isn't comfortable, but it has no large glass surfaces, and that's all that matters now. Tomorrow, I'll be gone from this place for good. I'll move to another city, another state somewhere. I can start fresh. I'll avoid ground floor apartments. I'll cover mirrors at night. I'll be careful about reflective surfaces, and I'll never again look too long at my own reflection for fear of noticing that its movements come just a fraction of a second before my own. The 7th floor of my building doesn't exist. At least that's what I told myself. Until 3 weeks ago, the elevator panel shows it clearly, buttons for floors 1 through 12. But everyone knows the building was designed with the superstition of certain cultures in mind. No 13th floor, no 7th floor, just an architectural quirk, a numbering system that jumps from 6 to 8. I never questioned it until that Friday evening when everything I thought I knew about my home began to unravel. The chill that ran down my spine when the elevator stopped at the 7th floor still haunts me. It wasn't supposed to be there. I've always been a creature of habit after 5 years working at the same accounting firm. I've perfected my routine: leave the office by 5:30 p.m., catch the 5:40 bus, and arrive at my apartment building by 6 p.m. Sharp. The predictability comforts me. 12 floors of identical corridors, identical doors, identical lives stacked one at top. Another, my little box on the 9th floor, has been home for 6 years. Now that particular Friday had been brutal. End of quarter. Reports a system crash that nearly lost 3 weeks of data, and my boss breathing down my neck about deadlines. By the time I dragged myself into the lobby of my building, my shoulders ached with tension, and a dull throb had established itself behind my right eye. Mrs. Garza from the 5th floor nodded to me from her mailbox. We exchanged our usual pleasantries about the unseasonably cool weather, the familiar scent of Mr. Patterson's cooking. Something with garlic and onions drifted down from his 1st floor apartment. Everything normal. Everything as it should be. The elevator arrived with its customary ding, and I stepped inside, grateful to find it empty. I jabbed the button for the 9th floor and leaned against the back wall, loosening my tie. The doors slid closed, and the familiar hum of machinery filled the small space as the elevator began its ascent. 1, 2, 3. The illuminated numbers changed on the panel. My eyelids grew heavy. 4, 5, 6. The elevator slowed unexpectedly. The sudden deceleration made my stomach lurch. I opened my eyes just as the display changed to 7-7. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. There was no 7th floor. Everyone knew that. Management had even sent out a memo when I first moved in, explaining the numbering system, cultural considerations resulting in the omission of certain floors. Yet here I was, stopping at a floor that shouldn't exist. The doors slid open with painful slowness. Beyond them lay a corridor identical to mine, yet fundamentally wrong. The hallway stretched into darkness. The overhead lights either burn out or never installed. Only the faint red glow of an exit sign at the far end provided any illumination, casting the corridor in a bloody hue. The air that rushed in felt wrong, stale, and unnaturally cold, carrying a faint scent. I couldn't identify, something ancient and musty, like old books left too long in a damp basement. My heart hammered against my ribs. I jabbed the close door button repeatedly, my finger becoming more frantic with each press. Nothing happened. The doors remained stubbornly open, as if inviting me to step out into that impossible hallway. That's when I heard them, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere down the darkened corridor. The sound echoed oddly, as if the space were much larger than it appeared. I pressed myself against the back wall of the elevator, my mouth dry as sand. The footsteps grew closer, yet I could see nothing moving in the shadows. My rational mind grasped for explanations: a maintenance worker, another resident, a security guard making rounds. But why would anyone be on a floor that didn't exist? A blast of frigid air swept into the elevator, bringing with it that musty smell now stronger. My teeth began to chatter, partly from cold, partly from fear. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the elevator doors. I couldn't see anyone there, just the empty threshold between elevator and corridor. Yet I felt a presence, a weight in the air, a pressure against my skin. Something was standing there watching me. My breath came in short, painful gasps. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears. My vision began to narrow, darkness creeping in at the edges. I was going to pass out, part of me welcomed it. With a final, desperate lunge, I slammed my palm against the control panel. Striking every button at once, the elevator chimed in protest. But the doors finally mercifully began to close as the gap narrowed. I felt something brush past me, a cold current of air, or perhaps something more substantial. The hairs on my arms and neck stood on end for a fraction of a second. I thought I caught a whiff of cologne, old-fashioned and heavy with spice, mingling with that musty odor. Then the doors sealed shut and the elevator lurched upward. I collapsed against the wall. My legs suddenly unable to support my weight, sweat soaked through my shirt. Despite the lingering chill, the overhead light flickered once, twice, then stabilized as the elevator continued its journey. When the display showed 9, I bolted out the moment the doors opened wide enough to squeeze through, standing in the familiar, well-lit corridor of my floor. I gulped down air that tasted normal, smelled normal as I fumbled with my keys at my apartment door. I glanced back just in time to see the elevator doors closing. The digital display above the elevator showed it was descending to the 7th floor. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake dissecting what had happened, searching for rational explanations. Perhaps the building's numbering system was just for show, a marketing gimmick to appeal to superstitious buyers. While the actual floor still existed, maybe I had misread the display, hallucinating a 7 where there was actually a 6 or an 8. I decided to ask my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, about it. The next morning, she lived in the building since it was constructed. When I casually mentioned the 7th floor, her expression changed, subtle but unmistakable. A tightening around the eyes, a slight pursing of the lips. She asked why I wanted to know. Her tone remained pleasant, but something in her voice made me backpedal. I laughed it off, saying I was just curious about the building's design. She nodded and mumbled something about architectural superstitions before hurriedly excusing herself. Her reaction only deepened my unease that weekend. I took the stairs everywhere, 12 flights up and down, left my legs burning, but the alternative, facing that elevator again, was unthinkable by Monday morning. However, I couldn't avoid it any longer. Late for work after a nearly sleepless night, I stood before the elevator, my palm hovering over the call button. Just as I was about to press it, Mr. Abernathy from the 12th floor joined me in the lobby. His presence bolstered my courage, safety, and numbers. I told myself the elevator arrived. We both got in, and I pressed 9 while he selected 12. The ride was uneventful for the next week. I timed my comings and goings to coincide with other residents, never alone in the elevator, never vulnerable. The incident began to lose its sharp edges in my memory, softening into something that could have been a stress-induced hallucination. Long hours, exhaustion, and overactive imagination that had to be it until last Tuesday. I worked late, much later than usual. By the time I dragged myself home, the lobby was deserted. I stood before the elevator, debating whether to tackle the stairs. Despite my exhaustion, the display showed the elevator was already on its way, down from an upper floor. I decided to wait, hoping another resident might join me. No one came when the doors opened to an empty car. I hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. I needed sleep more than I needed to indulge this paranoia. The ride began normally enough. 1, 2, 3. My muscles gradually relaxed as the elevator passed each floor without incident. 4, 5, 6. My phone chimed with a text message as I reached into my pocket. The elevator lurched violently, throwing me against the wall. The lights flickered and for one terrifying moment went out completely before resuming at half their normal brightness. The display read 7. My heart nearly stopped. Not again. I lunged for the control panel, but before I could reach it, the elevator came to a smooth halt. The door slid open. The 7th floor corridor appeared different this time, illuminated for one thing. though the light was sickly and uneven, emanating from sconces along the walls, rather than overhead fixtures. The wallpaper pattern matched the rest of the building, but the colors were wrong, faded, as if exposed to years of sunlight. The carpet beneath the doors showed visible wear patterns, and the doors themselves. They had numbers 701, 702, 703, apartment numbers for a floor that didn't exist. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable even to reach for the close button. My gaze traveled down the hallway, taking in details I'd missed in the darkness, before the exit sign at the end still glowed red. But now I could see that one of the apartment doors stood slightly ajar, 707, just a crack, but enough to reveal absolute darkness beyond a cold draft seeped from that opening, carrying with it that same musty smell now identifiable as old paper dust and something metallic like copper pennies or blood. The elevator chimed impatiently somehow. That mundane sound broke my paralysis. I stabbed at the close button. Then at 9, then at every button I could reach, the doors remained open. The chime sounded again, louder this time, almost admonishing from the partially open door of 707. I heard movement, a soft shuffling like slippered feet dragging across carpet. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice, humming a melody I almost recognized, distorted by the poor acoustics of the hallway. An old tune, the kind my grandfather might have whistled. The door to 707 began to swing wider. I threw myself at the elevator doors, trying to force them closed with my bare hands. My fingers scrabbled uselessly against the metal. The humming grew louder. Closer light from the hallway illuminated a pale hand curling around the edge of the door. To 707 at that moment, the elevator doors finally responded, sliding shut with agonizing slowness. I caught a glimpse of something emerging from 707, a shape of figure moving with unnatural jerky motions toward the elevator. The doors sealed just as a shadow fell across the threshold. The elevator resumed its journey as if nothing had happened. No lurching, no flickering lights, just the smooth hum of machinery carrying me upward. I collapsed against the wall, my clothes soaked with cold sweat, my breathing rapid and shallow. When I reached my floor, I ran to my apartment and locked every lock, even using the security chain I'd never bothered with. Before I spent the night with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and settling noise of the building. That was a week ago. I've taken the stairs exclusively since then. No matter how tired I am, yesterday I inquired with management about the building's floor plan, keeping my tone casual, curious. The property manager, a new hire who didn't know me, was happy to show me the original architectural drawings. There on paper, plain as day, 12 floors with 7 conspicuously absent. The space between floors 6 and 8 was reduced, as if floor 7 had been erased, not just in name, but in physical reality. Why no 7th floor? I asked, forcing lightness into my voice. The manager explained it was common in many buildings. Cultural superstitions, marketing considerations, nothing unusual. When I pressed further, asking if there had ever been plans for a 7th floor, her demeanor changed. She suddenly remembered an urgent call she needed to make and ushered me out of her office last night. I did something I'd been avoiding. I accessed the building's online tenant portal and checked the directory. No apartments numbered in the 700s. No residents assigned to a 7th floor. According to every official record, it doesn't exist yet. I know what I saw, what I felt, what I heard this morning. Mrs. Chen from across the hall stopped me as I was leaving for work. She looked tired with dark circles under her eyes. "You asked about the 7th floor," she said without preamble. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. She glanced around the empty hallway, then lowered her voice. "Don't take the elevator alone." Her eyes held mine, conveying the weight behind her simple warning. Before I could ask anything more, she retreated into her apartment tonight. As I write this, I can hear the elevator moving in its shaft, stopping at floors, including one that shouldn't exist occasionally. I press my ear against my apartment wall, listening. Sometimes I swear I can hear humming coming through the ventilation system. That same half-familiar tune. I've started researching the building's history. There are gaps, inconsistencies, rumors about a fire during construction, about permit issues that delayed opening. Nothing concrete about a 7th floor, but nothing that definitively rules it out either. Tomorrow I plan to visit the city archives to look at older records. I need to know what happened here. Why a floor would be erased, not just from the building's numbering system, but from everyone's acknowledgement. For now, though, I sit with my back against the wall, listening to the elevator move up and down its shaft, wondering who or what rides it to the floor that doesn't exist. The floor I've seen with my own eyes, the floor where something waits, humming an old tune, reaching out with pale hands, and sometimes in the stillness of night, when the building settles into silence. I swear I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, deliberate footsteps that pause just for a moment before continuing. Past I never check to see if anyone's there. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some floors once visited never truly let you leave. The yellow eyes haunt me even when I close mine. They appear in that space between wakefulness and sleep, glowing like twin embers in the darkness. It's been 3 weeks since I first saw the dog at Lake Evergreen, and something fundamental has shifted in my world. The rational part of my brain, the part that pays bills and nods politely at neighbors, insists it was just a stray, but deep down in that primal chamber where instinct resides, I know better. Whatever followed me that night wasn't just a dog. I've always been a creature of routine. After my divorce last year, the nightly walks became my sanctuary. The 3-mile loop around Lake Evergreen offered the perfect combination of exercise and solitude during daylight hours. The path teems with joggers, families, and the occasional tour group admiring our small town's modest attraction. But after 10 p.m., the space transforms. The lamplight creates islands of dim yellow illumination amid vast pools of shadow. The water becomes a black mirror reflecting fractured moonlight. The silence is broken only by the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures and the rhythmic crunch of my footsteps on gravel that night. 3 weeks ago began like any other. I parked my car in the nearly empty lot, zipped my jacket against the October chill, and set out counterclockwise around the lake. The first lap was uneventful, just me and my thoughts circling like faithful companions. It wasn't until I passed the halfway point on my second lap that I sensed something had changed. The hair on the back of my neck stood up before my conscious mind registered why I wasn't alone anymore. Initially, I thought it was another night walker, perhaps a fellow insomniac seeking relief from racing thoughts. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it a large canine silhouette about 30 yards behind me. It moved with purpose, matching my pace with uncanny precision. In the dim light, its fur appeared to absorb the darkness around it, creating an outline more defined by absence than presence. I quickened my pace slightly, heart thumping against my ribs. The dog adjusted its speed accordingly, maintaining the exact distance between us when I slowed. It slowed when I stopped, abruptly pretending to tie my shoe. It sat on its hunches and watched me with unnerving patience. Those eyes, even from that distance, I could see them, clearly luminous amber orbs that seemed to generate their own light rather than reflect it. They fixed on me with an intelligence that felt measured, calculating not the gaze of a hungry stray or a lost pet, but something evaluating. After completing that second lap, rationality briefly reasserted itself. It was just a dog, probably abandoned by some irresponsible owner. I decided to approach it, thinking perhaps it had a collar with identification. I turned and walked deliberately toward the animal. Speaking in the soft tones people instinctively use with pets, the dog immediately backed away, maintaining our separation. I took another step. It retreated by the same measure for a moment. I looked around for anyone who might claim ownership of this strange animal. The parking lot remained empty save for my car, and the path stretched vacant in both directions. When I turned back, the dog was gone. Not running away, not hiding behind the nearby bench or trash can, simply gone. I searched the nearby bushes and peered down the various exit paths, but found no trace of the animal. It had vanished as completely as a stone dropped in the lake center. That should have been the end. A strange encounter, perhaps. Fodder for conversation. Before I could ask anything more, she retreated into her apartment tonight as I write this. I can hear the elevator moving in its shaft, stopping at floors, including one that shouldn't exist occasionally. I press my ear against my apartment wall, listening. Sometimes I swear I can hear humming coming through the ventilation system. That same half-familiar tune. I've started researching the building's history. There are gaps, inconsistencies, rumors about a fire during construction, about permit issues that delayed opening, nothing concrete about a seventh floor, but nothing that definitively rules it out either. Tomorrow I plan to visit the city archives to look at older records. I need to know what happened here. Why a floor would be erased, not just from the building's numbering system, but from everyone's acknowledgement. For now, though, I sit with my back against the wall, listening to the elevator move up and down its shaft, wondering who or what rides it to the floor that doesn't exist. The floor I've seen with my own eyes, the floor where something waits, humming an old tune, reaching out with pale hands, and sometimes in the stillness of night, when the building settles into silence. I swear I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, deliberate footsteps that pause just for a moment before continuing. Past I never check to see if anyone's there. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some floors once visited never truly let you leave. The yellow eyes haunt me even when I close mine. They appear in that space between wakefulness and sleep, glowing like twin embers in the darkness. It's been 3 weeks since I first saw the dog at Lake Evergreen, and something fundamental has shifted in my world. The rational part of my brain, the part that pays bills and nods politely at neighbors, insists it was just a stray, but deep down in that primal chamber where instinct resides, I know better. Whatever followed me that night wasn't just a dog. I've always been a creature of routine. After my divorce last year, the nightly walks became my sanctuary. The 3-mile loop around Lake Evergreen offered the perfect combination of exercise and solitude during daylight hours. The path teems with joggers, families, and the occasional tour group admiring our small town's modest attraction. But after 10 p.m., the space transforms. The lamplight creates islands of dim yellow illumination amid vast pools of shadow. The water becomes a black mirror reflecting fractured moonlight. The silence is broken only by the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures and the rhythmic crunch of my footsteps on gravel that night. 3 weeks ago began like any other. I parked my car in the nearly empty lot, zipped my jacket against the October chill, and set out counterclockwise around the lake. The first lap was uneventful, just me and my thoughts circling like faithful companions. It wasn't until I passed the halfway point on my second lap that I sensed something had changed. The hair on the back of my neck stood up before my conscious mind registered why I wasn't alone anymore. Initially, I thought it was another night walker, perhaps a fellow insomniac seeking relief from racing thoughts. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it, a large canine silhouette about 30 yards behind me. It moved with purpose, matching my pace with uncanny precision. In the dim light, its fur appeared to absorb the darkness around it, creating an outline more defined by absence than presence. I quickened my pace slightly, heart thumping against my ribs. The dog adjusted its speed accordingly, maintaining the exact distance between us when I slowed. It slowed when I stopped, abruptly pretending to tie my shoe. It sat on its hunches and watched me with unnerving patience. Those eyes, even from that distance, I could see them, clearly luminous amber orbs that seemed to generate their own light rather than reflect it. They fixed on me with an intelligence that felt measured, calculating not the gaze of a hungry stray or a lost pet, but something evaluating. After completing that second lap, rationality briefly reasserted itself. It was just a dog, probably abandoned by some irresponsible owner. I decided to approach it, thinking perhaps it had a collar with identification. I turned and walked deliberately toward the animal. Speaking in the soft tones people instinctively use with pets, the dog immediately backed away, maintaining our separation. I took another step. It retreated by the same measure for a moment. I looked around for anyone who might claim ownership of this strange animal. The parking lot remained empty save for my car, and the path stretched vacant in both directions. When I turned back, the dog was gone. Not running away, not hiding behind the nearby bench or trash can, simply gone. I searched the nearby bushes and peered down the various exit paths, but found no trace of the animal. It had vanished as completely as a stone dropped in the lake center. That should have been the end. A strange encounter, perhaps. Fodder for conversation. Becoming almost physical in its demand, I've begun to notice other changes. Food tastes like ash in my mouth. My reflection in the mirror seems slightly delayed, moving a fraction of a second after I do, and sometimes just at the edge of my vision. I catch glimpses of my skin rippling like dark water. The sun will set in. 20 minutes, my car keys sit on the table before me, and already I can feel my hand twitching toward them. I know I'll go to the lake tonight. I know the dog will be waiting, and I know with a certainty that terrifies me to my core, that this time I won't be walking behind it. This time I'll be looking back with yellow eyes watching for someone else to follow. The scratching started 3 nights ago, faint at first, like fingernails dragging lightly across drywall. A sound so subtle I convinced myself it was the old Victorian house settling, or perhaps mice in the walls. But mice don't leave notes, and houses don't write warnings in handwriting that looks like it belongs to someone who's forgotten how to hold a pen. I've lived alone in this house for almost 2 years. The home office became my sanctuary after the divorce, a place where I could rebuild my freelance writing career piece by piece. The cork bulletin board above my desk was nothing special, just a practical tool for organizing deadlines, pinning business cards and keeping track of article ideas. Nothing remarkable until the first note appeared. It was a Tuesday morning when I saw it, a small yellow post-it note stuck among my orderly arrangement of reminders and to-do lists. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming I'd written it myself during a late-night work session and simply forgotten. But when I got close enough to read the scrolled message, "Don't forget about the shadows," an involuntary shiver ran down my spine. The handwriting wasn't mine, not even close. The letters were jagged, pressed deeply into the paper as if written with tremendous force, yet somehow still nearly illegible. I tore it down immediately, crumpled it in my palm. My hand trembled slightly as I tossed it into the wastebasket. A prank I decided someone had been in my house. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt a flare of anger. I checked all the doors and windows, locked every one of them. I even examined the door frames and windowsills for signs of forced entry. Nothing. The next morning, a new note awaited me. "It's getting late," it read in the same disturbing handwriting. My throat constricted as I stared at it. I live alone. The doors were locked, the security system had been armed all night, yet somehow someone had entered my private space and left this message. I took photos of the note, its positioning on the board, even the pushpin holding it in place. I'm not sure why evidence, perhaps for whom I couldn't exactly go to the police. With complaints about cryptic post-it notes, they'd think I was losing my mind sometimes. I wonder if they'd be right that night. I locked the office door before going to bed. I even wedged a chair under the doorknob, feeling ridiculous but desperate for some peace of mind. Sleep came reluctantly, my ears straining to catch any sound of movement in the house. When morning arrived, I approached the office with dread coiling in my stomach like a cold, heavy snake. The chair remained in place. The door was still locked. I used my key with shaking hands, pushed the door open, and felt my heart stutter in my chest. There in the center of the bulletin board was a new note. "I see you when you sleep." My legs nearly gave out. I stumbled to my desk chair and collapsed into it. My breathing shallow and rapid. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. My eyes darted to every corner, searching for some explanation, some sign of how this was happening. The windows were sealed shut. They had been since last winter when I'd cocked them closed to keep out the draft. There was no other entrance to the room except the door I just unlocked. I took the notes to a handwriting analyst, a former police specialist who now ran a private practice downtown. I told him they were for a story I was researching. He studied them through a magnifying glass, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is unusual," he said. Finally, he explained that the writing showed signs of severe distress or physical impairment, possibly written by someone with neurological damage or under extreme duress. When I asked if all 3 notes were written by the same person, his answer chilled me. Yes, but he hesitated. "The most recent one shows deterioration, as if the condition is worsening." He pointed to where the pen had torn through the paper in places. How the letters became increasingly malformed that night. I installed a motion-activated camera in the office, positioned to capture the entire room. Especially the bulletin board. I set it to send alerts to my phone if it detected movement. Then I locked the door again, adding a new deadbolt I'd purchased that afternoon. I even placed a thin line of talcum powder along the threshold, an old trick I'd read about in a detective novel. I barely slept, checking my phone every few minutes for alerts from the camera. None came when dawn broke. I approached the office with a mixture of hope and dread. The powder line was undisturbed, The deadbolt was engaged. I unlocked the door with trembling hands. A new note waited for me. The walls are too thin, the camera had captured nothing. The recording showed an empty room all night. The bulletin board clearly visible one moment, there was no note, and in the next frame there, it was as if it had materialized from thin air. I began to question my sanity. Was I writing these notes myself in some dissociative state? Was this some bizarre form of sleepwalking? I scheduled an appointment with my doctor, who referred me to a neurologist. The brain scan showed nothing abnormal. No evidence of seizures or other neurological issues that might explain blackouts or lost time. The notes continued to appear, each more disturbing than the last. I'm getting closer. Can you feel me breathing? Soon we'll meet each morning. I would find them pinned to my bulletin board. Despite increasingly elaborate security measures, I installed additional cameras, motion sensors, even a pressure mat under the carpet. Nothing ever triggered them. No one ever appeared on the footage. Yet the notes kept coming. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My work suffered. I jumped at the slightest sounds of the house I once found so charming. Now felt like a prison, or worse, like I was sharing it with something I couldn't see or understand. I began researching the history of the house. It was built in 1897, and records showed a succession of owners, none particularly noteworthy. No tragic deaths, no notorious crimes. The house had been empty for nearly 2 years before I purchased it. The previous owner, an elderly woman who had moved to a retirement community. I tracked her down, hoping for answers. Mrs. Keller was 93, her mind still sharp despite her frail body. When I mentioned the office, something flickered in her eyes. She admitted that she had used that room as a sewing room, and yes, she had experienced strange occurrences. Items moved, the sensation of being watched, and once she said in a near whisper, she had seen something, a figure just at the edge of her vision, standing in the corner where my desk now sits. She'd moved her sewing machine to another room after that and kept the door closed. My skin prickled with goose flesh as she spoke. I asked if anyone had died in the house. She shook her head but then paused, her rheumy eyes distant with memory. No one had died there, she said, but the man who built the house had a brother who suffered from what they called nervous hysteria. In those days, he had been confined to that room during his episodes, which grew more frequent and severe over time. Eventually, he was committed to an asylum where he died some years later. That night, I couldn't bring myself to return to the house. I checked into a hotel, desperate for a night of uninterrupted sleep. The next morning, I felt marginally better, clear-headed enough to form a plan. I would confront whatever was happening head-on. If there was something supernatural at work, I would address it directly. If it was a mental health issue of my own, I would seek the appropriate help. I returned home in the late afternoon, my stomach knotting with anxiety as I unlocked the door. The house was quiet, seemingly unchanged. I went straight to the office, steeling myself for whatever new message might await me. The bulletin board was empty. Every single note, memo, and business card had been removed. In the center, pinned with a single red push pin, was a larger sheet of paper. The familiar, tortured handwriting covered it completely. The words crammed together, some written over others, in a frenzied palimpsest. It took me several minutes to decipher the message. I have been trying to warn you. They kept me here too. They are in the walls. They want what's inside you. They made me write things. I didn't mean they will do the same to you. Get out before you can't. As I stared at the message, trying to process its meaning, I became aware of a sound, that same faint scratching I'd been hearing at night, only now it was coming from inside the wall, directly behind the bulletin board, and it was getting louder. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scratching intensified, no longer resembling fingernails, but something harder, like metal scraping against wood and plaster. A hairline crack appeared in the wall, extending upward from behind the bulletin board. I didn't wait to see what would emerge. I ran from the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook so violently I could barely grab my car keys. I made it to my car and drove away, with no destination in mind other than away from here. I'm writing this from another hotel room. My third in as many days. I haven't been back to the house. I'm not sure I ever will. I've contacted a realtor about selling the property, though I haven't told her why. What could I possibly say? Last night, I woke suddenly at 3:17 a.m., the same time I used to hear the scratching in my office walls. The hotel room was silent, but a familiar sensation of being watched crept over me. I turned on the lamp beside the bed. There on the hotel notepad on the nightstand was a message in that same tormented handwriting you can check out. But you can't leave me behind. I don't know what's following me or what it wants. I don't know if it's trying to help me or harm me, but I do know this: wherever I go, it finds me. And its messages are getting longer, more coherent, as if it's getting stronger, or closer, or both. Sometimes in the deepest hours of the night, I think I catch glimpses of movement at the edges of my vision, a darkness that seems deeper than shadow, a subtle distortion of the air, and sometimes when I'm drifting on the edge of sleep, I swear I can hear breathing that isn't my own. I've started carrying a notebook with me. If whatever is happening is truly beyond my control, if something is trying to communicate through me, I want to capture it, understand it. Maybe that's the writer in me still searching for a story, even in the midst of terror. Or maybe it's my way of maintaining some illusion of control. Either way, I've noticed something troubling. My handwriting has started to change just slightly at first. The angle of my letters, the pressure of my pen, but it's becoming more pronounced, more jagged, more desperate, more like the notes the first time I heard it rain, lashed against my windows like desperate fingers, trying to get in a slow, deliberate scraping sound. Not quite a drag, not quite a scratch, moved across the ceiling above my head. 3 a.m. and sleep evaporated instantly, replaced by that primal alertness that comes when your body recognizes danger before your mind can rationalize it away. I lay frozen eyes fixed on the textured, white surface above me, tracking the invisible path of whatever created that sound. It stopped directly over my bed. My penthouse apartment was supposed to be the crown jewel of the building. Nothing above you but the sky the realtor had promised. With rehearsed enthusiasm, she'd conveniently omitted the small attic space that technically belonged to my neighbor's unit. An architectural quirk from when the building was reconfigured decades ago. A shared structure she'd later admitted when I pressed her. After the closing, but nothing I needed to worry about, just a storage space that nobody used. Nobody except something that moved on rainy nights. After that first night, I convinced myself it was the building settling, or perhaps rodents seeking shelter from the storm. But rodents don't pace with the measured rhythm of footsteps. They don't stop and start again, as if listening. And they certainly don't seem to respond when you call out, "Is someone there?" With a tremor in your voice that embarrasses you even when alone. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've traveled to remote locations for my work as a photographer, spent nights alone in abandoned buildings to capture the perfect light at dawn. I understand the tricks the mind plays in darkness, but what happened in the weeks that followed tested the boundaries of rational explanation and my own grip on reality. The sounds established a pattern. They came most often during storms, but occasionally on clear nights. They always started around 3 a.m. and lasted anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours. Sometimes just the scraping, sometimes footsteps, and on the worst nights, a sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor, back and forth, with agonizing slowness after 2 weeks of disrupted sleep and fraying nerves. I knocked on my neighbor's door. Marcus was a middle-aged accountant who looked perpetually exhausted when I mentioned the attic. His expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes that suggested discomfort. He explained that he'd never used the space in the 7 years he'd lived there. Just some old boxes from the previous owner that he'd never bothered to remove. Too much of a hassle to climb up there, he said, especially with his bad knee. I asked if I could take a look sometime, and he hesitated before agreeing. Though he warned me there was nothing to see, I left his apartment with a distinct impression he was hiding something. Though I couldn't articulate what or why, that night the sounds were louder, more insistent, as if whatever dwelled above knew I was asking questions the next morning. Blur-eyed from another sleepless night, I contacted the building manager. Mr. Grayson was skeptical but professional, agreeing to inspect the attic space. That afternoon, I waited anxiously in my apartment, listening to his footsteps above as he moved around. After 20 minutes, he descended and reported finding nothing unusual. Just some old cardboard boxes, dust cobwebs, and some minor mold issues he'd have someone address. I pressed him about the sounds, describing in detail. What I'd been hearing, his expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes made me think he wasn't telling me everything he suggested. Old buildings make strange noises, and the recent weather changes could be causing the structure to contract and expand before leaving. He asked if I was under any particular stress lately, if I was taking any medications that might cause auditory disturbances. The implication was clear: the problem was in my head, not my ceiling. That night, the activity above reached a fever pitch. It started earlier than usual, just after midnight, and with an intensity I hadn't experienced before. The footsteps moved with purpose, circling, stopping, then rushing across the length of the attic. The scraping sound had developed a rhythm, 3 long drags, followed by silence. Then repeated. My ceiling light flickered, though there was no storm, and for one terrifying moment I swore. I saw the paint bulge downward, as if under pressure from above. I grabbed my phone and texted Mr. Grayson demanding another inspection. No response. I considered calling the police, but stopped myself. What would I tell them? That I was hearing scary noises, that my ceiling was breathing? They dismiss it as quickly as the building manager had. Sleep was impossible. I sat in my living room as far from the sounds as possible, researching the building's history on my laptop. The structure dated back to the 1920s, originally a hotel before being converted to apartments in the 1970s. A few minor mentions in local news over the decades. Renovations, ownership changes, a small fire in the East Wing in 1983. Nothing suggesting tragedy or the kind of history that spawns ghost stories around 4 a.m. The noises suddenly stopped. The silence felt more threatening than the sounds had been. My apartment seemed to hold its breath. Then my phone chimed with a text from Mr. Grayson. "We'll check again tomorrow at 2 p.m. The next day passed in a haze of exhaustion and dread. By the time Mr. Grayson arrived precisely at 2 p.m., I'd convinced myself that whatever was happening had a rational explanation. Water damage, structural issues, perhaps even Marcus sneaking up there. For some reason, he didn't want to admit Mr. Grayson brought a maintenance worker with him this time. A younger man named Cal, who carried a toolbox and looked distinctly uncomfortable. They disappeared through the access panel in the hallway outside Marcus's apartment. Marcus himself was at work, having left me a key to access the hallway entrance to the attic. Their inspection lasted longer this time, nearly an hour when they finally emerged. Mr. Grayson looked troubled. He reported finding nothing out of the ordinary, though they'd done a more thorough check, even moving the boxes to examine the entire space. Cal remained silent throughout, avoiding eye contact. After Mr. Grayson left, I caught Cal in the hallway. When I pressed him for details, he reluctantly admitted that he'd felt something off about the attic, but couldn't explain what. The temperature had dropped dramatically in one corner, and his flashlight had dimmed for no apparent reason. Before he could say more, his radio crackled with Mr. Grayson calling him to another task, and he hurried away with an apologetic shrug. That night I waited. The apartment felt different somehow, as if the space itself had become aware of me. The familiar corners and shadows of my home now seemed to conceal secrets. I positioned myself in the hallway with a clear view of my bedroom ceiling, armed with my phone's camera, ready to record any disturbance. Hours passed in silence. By 3:30 a.m., my vigilance began to waver. Perhaps the inspections had solved whatever issue was causing the noises. Perhaps it had all been in my head after all. I was about to retire to bed when the first scratch came louder than ever, before a deliberate, angry sound like nails dragging across the ceiling. My phone was recording, instantly pointed upward as I moved slowly into the bedroom. The scratching continued, accompanied now by a distinct tapping pattern. 3 quick taps. Pause. 3 quick taps. I called out, demanding to know who was there. The tapping stopped immediately. What happened next defies explanation. A dark stain began to form on my ceiling, spreading outward from a central point, like spilled ink blooming on paper. Not water damage, too dark, too purposeful in its movement. It formed a crude shape that, with mounting horror, I recognized as a handprint, large with elongated fingers pressed against the ceiling, as if something on the other side was trying to push through. I backed away, still recording my breath coming in short, painful gasps. The stain continued to spread, forming a second handprint beside the first, then a third. The entire ceiling now appeared to sag slightly, the white paint cracking along the edges of the dark marks. Panic finally broke my paralysis. I rushed from the apartment, not stopping until I reached the building's lobby. The night security guard looked up in surprise at my disheveled appearance. I showed him the recording hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. His expression changed from concern to confusion. The video showed nothing but my empty ceiling, unmarked and ordinary. I spent the remainder of the night in a 24-hour diner across the street, watching my building through the window, as if expecting to see some external manifestation of the horror inside morning came with no answers. Only the crushing certainty that I couldn't return to my apartment alone. Desperation drove me to Marcus's door as soon as a reasonable hour arrived. When he answered, the dark circles under his eyes mirrored my own. Without preamble, I demanded to know what he knew about the attic. His initial denials crumbled under my insistence, and he finally invited me inside with the defeated air of a man unburdening a long-arid secret over coffee that neither of us touched. He confessed that he'd experienced similar disturbances when he first moved in. The previous owner had warned him never to enter the attic space to pretend it didn't exist. Marcus had dismissed the warning until the noises began. His investigation had revealed nothing physical, but the activity had intensified dramatically afterward, just as it had for me after weeks of escalating phenomena. He'd followed the previous owner's advice. He sealed the attic access in his apartment and never acknowledged the space again. The disturbances had eventually stopped. I asked why he hadn't warned me. His response was simple and chilling. He was afraid that speaking about it would make it start again for him. He believed that whatever was up there fed on attention and awareness. Investigate it, acknowledge it, fear it, and it grew stronger, ignore it completely, and it eventually moved on to someone else who would engage with it. The implication hung between us by ignoring it. He had redirected it toward me. My fury must have shown on my face because Marcus quickly added that he thought it was gone for good. The previous disturbances had happened years ago, and there had been 2 other tenants in my unit since then. With no complaints, he'd assumed whatever had been there had moved on permanently. I left his apartment with no clear plan, except the certainty that I couldn't continue as things were. The prospect of another night under that ceiling filled me with dread. But the thought of abandoning my home to this intrusion sparked a different kind of anger. This was my space. Whatever was trying to drive me out had no right to it. That evening I set up cameras in every room. I placed audio recorders strategically throughout the apartment. I researched cleansing rituals from various traditions and performed a hodgepodge ceremony that would have made any serious practitioner cringe, burning sage reciting protective prayers from 3 different religions, sprinkling salt in the corners. I didn't believe in any of it. Not really, but it gave me a sense of taking action. Rather than merely waiting for the next manifestation as night deepened, I positioned myself in the center of my living room, surrounded by my technological and spiritual defenses. The weight stretched my nerves to breaking point, every normal house sound. The refrigerator humming, the heating system cycling on the faint traffic noise from the street below, made me flinch. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., then 2. Nothing happened. The silence felt like a taunt at precisely 3:17 a.m. Every light in my apartment flickered simultaneously. The temperature plummeted so rapidly my breath clouded in front of me. And then the noises began, not from above this time, but from everywhere at once, scratching inside the walls, footsteps circling me. Though I could see the empty floor whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. My recording equipment emitted high-pitched feedback, then died completely. The protective circle of salt I'd laid down remained undisturbed, but somehow I sensed a presence within it, standing just behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. I didn't turn around, some primal instinct, warned that seeing it would cross a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. Instead, I spoke to it directly, my voice steadier than I expected. "This is my home," I said simply. "You don't belong here." The air around me seemed to compress pressure, building in my ears. The whispers intensified, forming patterns that almost but not quite resolved into words. I continued speaking, focusing on the idea that had formed, while talking with Marcus, this thing. Whatever it was fed on attention and fear. The more I investigated, the stronger it became. "I don't believe in you," I stated firmly. "I don't acknowledge you. You have no power here that I don't give you." The pressure increased until I thought my eardrums might rupture. Something cold brushed against my shoulder. a touch so light it might have been imagination, yet so distinct I had to stifle a scream. Still, I didn't turn. I kept my eyes fixed forward, repeating my denial of its existence, my rejection of its right to be in my space. Hours passed in this standoff. Dawn eventually lightened the windows, and with the first ray of sunlight, the presence receded. The apartment warmed gradually. My electronics remained dead, but the oppressive atmosphere had lifted in the weeks that followed. I developed a strange relationship with my home, and what dwelled above it. I never acknowledged the sounds when they came. I never investigated further. I lived my life as if sharing space was something I refused to see, and it retreated to the periphery. The manifestations became less frequent, less intense, though never completely absent. I still hear it on rainy nights, that deliberate scraping across the ceiling, but I've claimed my territory through stubborn denial, carved out a tenuous coexistence based on mutual disregard. I don't know what lies in the space above, and I've made peace with never knowing. Some mysteries I've learned are safer left unsolved, but sometimes in the moments between waking and sleep, I wonder if my strategy has truly worked, or if it's simply biding its time, growing stronger in the darkness. I refuse to illuminate, waiting for the moment my vigilance falters, and on the worst nights when the rain beats against my windows like desperate fingers trying to get in, I swear I can feel the ceiling watching me. There are moments when the veil between what we understand and what lurks beyond our comprehension thins to nearly nothing. I've come to learn that in those moments, sometimes things slip through, things that have no business being in our world. And once they find you, they never truly leave. My weekend retreat was supposed to be an escape. A small weathered cabin nestled in the dense woods of northern Michigan, far enough from civilization that cell reception was a luxury rather than an expectation. I had purchased it 3 years ago after my divorce, seeking a place where the constant noise of city life couldn't reach me for 2 days each week. I could pretend that my life hadn't fractured into before, and after that anxiety didn't follow me like a shadow. That Friday the forecast had called for light showers. What arrived instead was a biblical deluge. I had barely made it up the long dirt driveway before the rain transformed it into a muddy river. Thunder crashed overhead with such violence that I could feel it vibrating in my chest as I hurried inside. Groceries, clutched against my body by dusk water, streamed down the windows in sheets so thick they distorted the view of the pines outside, turning them into wavering, indistinct silhouettes. I had just finished preparing a simple dinner when the inevitable happened. A particularly vicious thunderclap followed by the sudden absence of electricity. I'm not a man who frightens easily. Growing up in a rural area, power outages were common enough that I had developed a routine. I set aside my half-eaten meal and retrieved the emergency flashlight from the kitchen drawer, then located the heavier lantern I kept for such occasions. Its warm glow spread across the living room, casting long shadows that danced along the walls with each subtle movement. The rational part of my mind insisted I should read a book, perhaps even enjoy the ambiance of the storm. Something about being forced to slow down to exist without the constant buzz of technology. But beneath that rational voice lurked another feeling, something primal and inexplicable. A heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before I positioned myself on the worn leather couch, facing the large picture window that dominated the western wall of the cabin. The lantern sat on the coffee table, illuminating my surroundings in a bubble of amber light while leaving the corners of the room in murky darkness. Rain pounded against the roof with a fury that made conversation impossible. Even if I'd had someone to talk with instead, I let my mind wander, trying to focus on the manuscript I'd brought to review, rather than the growing unease settling in my stomach. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I questioned whether I had seen anything at all. The heavy cotton curtain, forest green and thick enough to block the morning light when I wanted to sleep in, seemed to ripple just once, just slightly. The movement was so minimal that had I blinked, I would have missed it entirely. I lifted my gaze from the manuscript, focusing intently on the curtain. For several long moments, nothing happened. The fabric hung, still seemingly obedient to the laws of physics that dictated it shouldn't move without cause. I almost convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, the way the lantern's flame flickered and caused shadows to shift. Then it happened again, a deliberate movement as if something had brushed against it from the other side. Not the violent billowing that would accompany a draft, but something more controlled, more intentional. My heartbeat quickened the sudden rush of blood in my ears, nearly drowning out the rain for a moment. I set the manuscript aside and leaned forward, eyes locked on the curtain. The cabin was sealed tight against the storm. I had checked all the windows and doors upon arrival, a habit born from years of home ownership. There should be no breeze, no air current to explain the movement. "Hello," I called out, feeling immediately foolish for doing so. The sound of my voice seemed swallowed by the darkness, barely caring. Beyond the lantern's glow, I stood legs stiff from sitting and approached the window with measured steps. The floorboards creaked beneath me, each sound amplified by the tension gripping my body. The lantern in my hand cast my elongated shadow before me, stretching up the wall and across the ceiling, like some grotesque extension of myself. 3 feet from the window, I froze. There, visible against the fabric of the curtain, was the unmistakable impression of something pressing against it. From the outside, a vague shape, formless and yet distinctly present. My mind raced through explanations: a branch blown against the house, an animal seeking shelter, perhaps even a person stranded in the storm. But deep down, I knew it was none of these things. Branches don't press deliberately against windows. Animals don't stand upright at that height, and people cast shadows with recognizable forms. This was something else entirely. My throat constricted, suddenly parched. Despite the humidity hanging in the air, the lantern trembled in my grasp, causing the shape behind the curtain to waver and shift in the unstable light. I forced myself to breathe, to take another step forward. Whatever was on the other side of that glass, I needed to see it, to confirm or disprove the impossible thought taking root in my mind. With one swift motion, I yanked the curtain aside, thrusting the lantern forward to illuminate whatever waited outside. Nothing. The glass reflected my own face back at me, pale and drawn with tension beyond it. Only the darkness and the relentless rain, each drop catching the light as it fell. No figure, no creature, nothing that could have caused the impression I had so clearly seen moments before. I pressed my face closer to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to reduce the glare. The window was cold against my skin, the chills seeping into my bones as I scanned the darkness beyond. Nothing moved save for the rain, and the wind tossed branches, and yet as I began to pull away, to attribute what I'd seen to an overactive imagination, fueled by isolation and storm-induced anxiety, the curtain behind me fluttered again, this time more noticeably, as if gently brushed by fingertips. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs with such force I feared they might crack. The curtain settled back into place, as innocuous as ever. But the sensation lingered, the absolute certainty that something had been there watching me, something that had moved to stay behind me as I turned. My breathing came in short, shallow gasps, each one burning in my lungs as if I were inhaling ice. The lantern's flame dipped and swayed, responding to my trembling hands more than any draft sweat beaded along my hairline. Despite the chill that had settled into the cabin, I backed away from the window, unwilling to turn my back on it again. My mind cycled through explanations, each more desperate than the last. Perhaps the isolation was affecting me more than I realized. Perhaps I was more exhausted than I knew. Perhaps the storm was playing tricks with the air pressure, causing the curtains to move in ways that defied explanation. But none of these thoughts could explain away the feeling of being observed. Not just observed, studied, as if something was taking careful note of my reactions. My fear learning what made me tick. I retreated to the center of the room, placing the coffee table between myself and the window. A barrier so laughably inadequate that in any other circumstance, I might have found it humorous. But there was nothing funny about the way my skin crawled with the sensation of unseen eyes. The hours that followed were an exercise in endurance. I maintained my vigil, refusing to look away from the window for more than seconds at a time. The curtain remained still, but the damage was done. Every shadow seemed to harbor movement just beyond my direct gaze. Every creak of the cabin's frame, as it weathered the storm, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I contemplated leaving, driving back to the city despite the treacherous conditions, but the thought of stepping outside, of being exposed to whatever might be lurking in the darkness, was even more terrifying than remaining inside. At least here, walls separated me from whatever had been peering in. Or so I told myself as the night wore on. My fear took on a new dimension, not just of what might be outside, but of what might already be inside with me. I found myself checking over my shoulder with increasing frequency, scanning the darkened corners of the room. Where the lantern's light couldn't quite reach my mind, conjured images of pale figures standing just beyond the boundary of light watching. And waiting by the time the first hint of dawn brightened the eastern sky, I had cataloged every sound the cabin could make, the specific groan of the roof as the temperature changed, the hollow tap of rain finding its way down the chimney to the closed damper, below the subtle scratch of tree branches against the siding, and one sound I couldn't identify, a soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When full daylight finally arrived, I performed a thorough inspection of the cabin's exterior. The ground beneath the window was a muddy mess, but devoid of footprints or any sign that something had stood there. The window itself was intact, the lock secure. Nothing in the physical world could explain what I had experienced. I left earlier than planned that Sunday, unable to face another night in the cabin. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the retreating structure. For just an instant, I could have sworn I saw movement at the window, a shifting of the curtain pulled aside by an unseen hand. I haven't returned to the cabin since that weekend, though I can't bring myself to sell it either. Sometimes I consider having someone else go there to see if they experience anything unusual. But I never follow through. What if they don't? What if whatever was there only shows itself to me? Or worse, what if it follows them back? Most troubling of all is what happens some nights as I'm falling asleep in my city apartment with the comforting sounds of traffic and neighbors all around me. Just as consciousness begins to slip away, I become aware of a presence, something standing in the corner of my bedroom watching. And though my eyes detect nothing when I jerk awake, I can't shake the sensation that lingers, the distinct feeling of fabric moving against my skin like a curtain being slowly drawn back. The air in room 307 felt wrong from the moment I stepped through the threshold. Not stale or musty as one might expect from a 200-year-old colonial hotel, but somehow expectant, as if the room itself had been waiting for me. The ornate brass key felt unnaturally cold against my palm as I locked the door behind me, the mechanism engaging with a deep, satisfied click that echoed against the high ceiling. I dismissed the prickling sensation across the back of my neck as travel fatigue. After all, I'd chosen this place, the historic Blackwood Hotel, precisely for its antiquated charm and connection to the past. What I couldn't have known was how intimately that past would soon connect with me. The afternoon sunlight filtered through heavy damask curtains, casting the room in a deceptively warm glow. Antique furniture gleamed with layers of polish accumulated over generations. A four-poster bed with an imposing mahogany headboard, a writing desk positioned beneath the window overlooking the cobblestone street, a tall wardrobe with a mirror that reflected the room at a slightly odd angle. Everything appeared meticulously preserved, like a museum exhibit one could sleep in. I unpacked, methodically arranging my clothes in the wardrobe, placing my laptop on the desk, and setting my phone to charge on the nightstand. The hotel manager had proudly informed me that they had modernized just enough to provide electrical outlets and Wi-Fi while maintaining the building's historical integrity. As day faded into evening, I returned from exploring the town's historic district, my camera filled with shots of colonial architecture, and my notebook scrolled with observations from my travel blog. Exhaustion settled into my bones as I showered in the surprisingly modern bathroom, annexed to the antique bedroom. By the time I emerged, steam billowing around me. Twilight had nearly completed its transition to night. That's when I first noticed it, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The temperature had dropped several degrees, enough to raise goosebumps across my still damp skin. I adjusted the ancient radiator, but it was already hissing and clanking at full capacity. Shrugging into a sweater, I attributed the chill to the building's age and poor insulation. The first night I was half asleep when the whispering began. At first I mistook it for the normal sounds of an old building settling, or perhaps other guests moving in the hallway. But as my consciousness hovered in that liminal space between wakefulness and dreams, The sounds crystallized into something more deliberate, hushed voices engaged in urgent conversation, just below the threshold of comprehension. My eyes snapped open, pulse quickening, but the room remained empty. The digital clock on my phone read 3:17 a.m. Forcing myself to sit up, I switched on the bedside lamp. The whispers ceased immediately. My breath came in shallow bursts as I scanned every corner of the room. Nothing seemed disturbed. Yet everything felt different. The mirror on the wardrobe now reflected a room that appeared longer, darker at its edges than the actual space warranted. The pattern in the wallpaper seemed to have shifted slightly, revealing subtle shapes that resembled faces in profile. I blinked hard and the distortions vanished. Must be jet lag playing tricks on my perception. I reasoned, though I'd only traveled 2 time zones east. I spent the remainder of that night with the lamp on, pretending to read while my peripheral vision constantly monitored the room's darkest corners. The hotel staff noticed nothing unusual about my haggarded appearance at breakfast when I casually inquired about room 307's history. The elderly waitress's hand trembled slightly as she refilled my coffee in a carefully neutral tone. She suggested I speak with the manager if I had any concerns about my accommodations. Her avoidance only intensified my curiosity that afternoon. I researched the Blackwood Hotel between visits to local landmarks. The building had indeed witnessed its share of history, originally a merchant's mansion during colonial times, later converted to a hospital during a regional conflict, and finally reimagined as a luxury hotel. In the 1920s, newspaper archives mentioned renovations, ownership changes, and visiting dignitaries, but nothing that explained the atmosphere in my room yet. As I scrolled through decades of information, a pattern emerged: vague references to incidents and disturbances. In the hotel's East Wing, where my room was located, several guests had apparently checked out early, foregoing refunds. Their reasons diplomatically omitted from the record. The second night I returned to my room, determined to approach any unusual occurrences with rational skepticism. I left my laptop recording audio while I pretended to sleep, the desk lamp providing minimal illumination. My heart thudded against my ribcage as darkness thickened around me. The temperature plummeted precisely at midnight. This time I remained perfectly still, eyes closed but senses hyper alert. The transformation happened gradually. First came the shift in air pressure, a heaviness that made my ears pop. Then the scent changed. The clean lemon polish smell replaced by something earthier, medicinal. When the whispers started, I focused intently on them, without betraying my wakefulness, though still largely unintelligible. Certain phrases began to penetrate the murmured chorus. Never found justice buried beneath must be revealed. A floorboard creaked near the foot of my bed. Sweat beaded across my forehead. Despite the cold, but I maintained my facade of sleep. Someone moved around the room with deliberate steps. The mirror on the wardrobe rattled ever so slightly. Pages rustled on the desk where I'd left my notebook. My muscles tensed with the effort of remaining motionless when every instinct screamed for flight. Then came the sensation of breath against my ear, carrying words that froze the blood in my veins. Help us reveal the truth. My control shattered. I bolted upright, gasping for air that suddenly seemed too thin. The room appeared empty, yet fundamentally altered. The walls had receded the ceiling, heightened, transforming the space into something closer to a hospital ward than a hotel room. Shadowy figures occupied the periphery of my vision, but when I turned to confront them directly, they dissolved into the darkened corners. My laptop had stopped recording, its battery inexplicably drained. My phone showed only static when I attempted to take photos, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal seeking escape. I grabbed my key and fled into the hallway. There the world returned to normal: warm lights, solid walls, the distant sound of the night clerk watching television in the lobby. I spent the remainder of the night dozing fitfully in a leather armchair near the front desk, claiming insomnia when questioned. The third day I approached the hotel's archives with newfound determination. The manager, perhaps concerned about potential negative reviews, granted me access to their historical records under the pretext of research for my travel blog. Hours of sifting through yellowed papers revealed the first concrete clue during its time as a hospital. A particular doctor had been accused of experimental treatments on patients, though never formally charged. He disappeared suddenly along with evidence that might have implicated him. The hospital wing was hastily converted to hotel rooms shortly thereafter. Room 307, my room, had been his office that evening. I returned with purpose. I rearranged the furniture to its original configuration, according to a floor plan I'd discovered in the archives. I placed my notebook open on the desk pen beside it. Then I waited for nightfall, no longer afraid, but electrified with anticipation. The transformation began precisely at midnight. My skin prickled as the air thickened, and the whispers commenced. This time, I spoke directly into the darkened room. I know what happened here. I want to help reveal the truth. The temperature dropped so rapidly that my breath clouded before me. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a single urgent voice. The shadowy figures materialized more distinctly. Now, patients in outdated hospital attire their forms translucent but unmistakable. My heart raced not with terror, but with adrenaline as the pen on the desk rose and began to move across the paper of its own accord. Coordinates, dates, names. My hand trembled as I reached for the notebook. The writing continuing around my fingers, the information detailed the location of patient records and evidence of malpractice that had been concealed within the building's walls during renovations. As the last word was written, the pen dropped. The figures gathered around me, their expressions shifting from desperation to something approaching peace. The room temperature gradually normalized. The shadows receded by dawn. I was alone again in a perfectly ordinary hotel room. I spent my final day in town locating the hidden cache of documents exactly where indicated, concealed in a forgotten maintenance space, between walls, working with a local historian and the reluctant but ultimately cooperative hotel management. We extracted crumbling patient records and a doctor's journal that confirmed decades of suspicions and rumors. The historian wept as she read accounts that would finally bring closure to numerous local families whose relatives had seemingly vanished from the hospital's records. As I checked out of the Blackwood Hotel, the manager avoided my gaze but ensured me that my stay would be complimentary. I declined, insisting on paying the full amount. Something about maintaining the proper balance of exchanges that night in a different hotel across town. I dreamt of room 307 in the dream. Sunlight streamed through open curtains, illuminating an empty space devoid of shadows. The whispers had been replaced by silence. Not the tense, expectant quiet of my first night, but the peaceful absence of sound that comes when long-held secrets have finally been spoken aloud. I still check the local newspaper website. Occasionally last month, they ran a feature on the formal memorial service held for the hospital patients, now properly identified and acknowledged. Room 307 at the Blackwood Hotel has been converted to a small historical exhibit about the building's past. The article noted that guests and staff report the East Wing feels lighter somehow, as if a weight has been lifted from the very foundations. They're right, of course. Some burdens can only be released when the truth is unearthed and acknowledged. Some spaces can only be cleansed when justice, however delayed, is finally served. As for me, I've developed a particular sensitivity to historic accommodations, a knack for sensing when the past isn't quite willing to remain behind thick walls and beneath fresh coats of paint. There are more truths waiting to be revealed, more silenced voices seeking the right listener. And now I know exactly how to hear them. The forest has a way of speaking to you when you're alone, not in words, but in the language of creaking branches and rustling leaves. I should know I'm a scientist, a man of reason and empirical evidence. Yet here I am, huddled in the corner of a decaying cabin, miles from civilization, watching shadows dance across warped floorboards as something scratches at the walls outside. Something that knows my name. 3 days ago, I entered the Blackwood Forest Preserve with nothing but my research equipment and enough supplies for a week-long expedition. The university had finally approved my grant to study the rare Myotis obscurus, a species of bat thought extinct for decades until trail cameras captured a blurry image. 6 months ago, this discovery could cement my reputation in the field of conservation biology. Worth the risk of going alone? I told myself no one else was available on such short notice, and the mating season would end. Soon the initial hike went smoothly. I cataloged specimens, recorded ambient sounds for later analysis, and tracked animal movements with practice efficiency. The forest grew denser as I ventured deeper. the canopy above gradually blocking out the sky until only occasional spears of sunlight penetrated the gloom. My GPS signal weakened cell service had disappeared hours earlier by late afternoon. Dark clouds gathered overhead and the temperature dropped precipitously. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, but mountain weather is notoriously unpredictable. As the first fat raindrops splashed against my face, I consulted my topographical map. The nearest ranger station was 15 miles back, but my field notes indicated an old fire road 2 miles ahead that might offer shelter. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I quickened my pace. The rain intensified, transforming from gentle pattern to driving sheets within minutes through the downpour. I spotted a shape among the trees, angular and artificial against the organic curves of nature. A cabin weathered gray and almost consumed by undergrowth stood in a small clearing. Providence, I thought, or so it seemed. The door hung partially open. Swollen from moisture and age, my flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a single-room interior. Dust covered everything: a small table, a chair, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow cot against the far wall. No signs of recent habitation. The roof appeared intact, despite the cabin's overall dilapidation. I called out a greeting, half from scientific caution, half from primal instinct. Only the echo of my voice returned. I set up camp inside, grateful for the solid walls between me and the worsening storm. After a meager dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, I organized my notes and prepared my equipment for the next day. The rain continued drumming against the roof with hypnotic persistence. I checked the door secured with a simple wooden bar that slid across metal brackets before settling onto the cot with my sleeping bag. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. The first sound that woke me was subtle, a light scratching against the exterior wall near my head. Probably branches blown by the wind, I reasoned, or perhaps small animals seeking shelter from the storm. I rolled over and drifted back to sleep. The second disturbance came hours later. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced on the cabin door. My eyes snapped open. The rain had stopped, leaving a silence broken only by the dripping of water from the eaves. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement outside. Nothing. Just as I convinced myself I'd dreamed it. The knocks repeated. 1, 2, 3, hello. I called, voice cracking from sleep and unease. Is someone there? No response. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept its beam across the room. Everything remained exactly as I'd left it. The door bar was still in place. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m., the witching hour, as my grandmother would have called it. I told myself it was likely a forest ranger, though I hadn't registered my specific location with the Park Service. Or perhaps another researcher. I'd seen no evidence of camps or other expeditions. The third possibility, local hunters or transients, seemed most plausible if unwelcome. I decided against opening the door. Instead, I called out that I was conducting authorized research and would appreciate being left alone until morning. The knocking stopped. I lay awake for another hour, listening to the natural sounds of the forest gradually resume. Finally, exhaustion overcame vigilance, and I fell into troubled sleep. The dream began immediately. I stood in the clearing outside the cabin, but the forest had changed. The trees leaned inward, their branches elongated and twisted into impossible shapes. Their leaves whispered words just beyond comprehension in the dream. I understood with perfect clarity that I was being watched, had been watched since the moment I entered the forest. I turned slowly, sensing a presence behind me. The dream forest pulsed with bioluminescence, casting everything in an ethereal blue glow. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, indistinct and shifting like smoke. It raised an appendage, not quite an arm, but something that served a similar purpose, and pointed directly at me. We have waited so long, the words weren't spoken. They appeared in my mind, accompanied by a sensation of cold pressure against my temples. We need your voice. I woke, gasping, sweat-soaked. Despite the cabin's chill, dawn light filtered through the single dirty window. Birds chirped outside their ordinary sounds. Reassuring after the night's disturbances, I told myself it was just a stress dream, triggered by isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. As I prepared breakfast on my portable stove, I noticed something peculiar, a pattern of moisture on the window glass. Not random condensation, but what appeared to be deliberate markings, dragged through the morning dew from my angle. They resembled letters, though in no alphabet I recognized. I approached the window, cautiously camera in hand, to document the anomaly as I drew closer. The pattern resolved into recognizable English. "Welcome back," my heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't told anyone about this specific location. No one knew where I was. More importantly, I'd never been here before. Scientific training kicked in, suppressing the initial surge of panic. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps previous researchers used this cabin regularly, and the message was left for someone else or local kids playing pranks on whoever might stumble upon the place. The message wasn't necessarily recent. Condensation could have simply revealed older markings. I photographed the window, then wiped it clean with my sleeve. The forest outside looked perfectly ordinary in daylight. No twisted trees or bioluminescence, just mixed hardwoods and conifers stretching to the horizon. After a brief debate with myself, I decided to continue my research rather than retreat. The strange occurrences were unsettling but not threatening. Besides the thought of admitting defeat to my department head over some unexplained noises, and a possible prank was more frightening than spending another night in the cabin. I spent the day setting up recording equipment in promising locations and collecting environmental data. The work was absorbing enough that the previous night's events gradually receded in importance by late afternoon. I'd almost convinced myself I'd overreacted. Then I found the marks. They circled the entire cabin, pressed into the soft ground, approximately 2 feet from the foundation. Not footprints exactly. They were too narrow, too deep, with strange articulations that reminded me of insect appendages, but scaled to impossible size. They formed a perfect perimeter, as if something had paced methodically around the structure. Testing for weaknesses, I photographed them, meticulously placing my field notebook beside each impression for scale. The nearest impressions to the door were the deepest, as if whatever made them had stood there longest, perhaps while knocking the scientific part of my brain, cataloged possibilities, large woodland creatures, perhaps multiple animals creating overlapping tracks, or erosion patterns from the previous night's rainfall. But another part of me, a primitive instinct that predated scientific reasoning, recognized a deliberate pattern, a containment circle, a boundary as daylight faded. I returned inside with growing apprehension. I reinforced the door bar with my tent poles and placed my heaviest equipment against the door. The window was too small for anything larger than a child to enter, but I covered it with my backpack frame. Nonetheless, night fell with unnatural swiftness. The forest sounds changed character, not quieting as nocturnal creatures replaced dural ones, but ceasing altogether. The silence pressed against my ears until I could hear my own heartbeat. Then it began again, soft scratching, at first circling the cabin with increasing speed, then knocking not just at the door this time, but at each wall in sequence, as if testing for response. I remained silent, documenting the phenomenon in my field journal with increasingly unsteady handwriting. 10:42 p.m., knocking pattern change now mimics human heartbeat rhythm. 10:57 p.m., temperature drops 7 degrees in 15 minutes. Breath visible 11:16 p.m. Scratching sounds have pattern 3 short, 3 long. 3 short sows, and Morse code 11:44 p.m. Voice-like sounds outside, not human language recording on phone. When I played back the recording, the sounds were barely audible beneath static. But what I could hear chilled me more than the rapidly dropping temperature. The noises had structure, cadence, rhythm. The unmistakable characteristics of language at midnight. Exactly everything stopped. The silence returned somehow heavier than before. I sat rigid on the edge of the cot, muscles aching from tension, ears straining for any sound. My scientific detachment had evaporated, entirely replaced by primitive fear. Sleep was impossible, yet somehow it took me. The dream was waiting. I stood again in the blue-tinged forest. But this time inside the cabin, the figure from before was pressed against the window. Its form more defined. It had a face, or rather a place where a face should be, with hollows that suggested eyes and a mouth. It pressed what might have been hands against the glass, leaving smears of phosphorescent material. "You came back. You always come back in the dream." I found my voice. "I've never been here before. Not in this body, not with these memories, but your pattern has been here. We recognize it. What are you? We are the caretakers, the collectors, the memory of the forest. What do you want from me? To complete the circle, to finish what you started, the figure's form rippled momentarily, taking a shape that seemed horrifyingly familiar. My shape, but wrong proportions. Distorted limbs, elongated eyes too large and black. You left something with us now? We need your voice to finish it. I jerked awake, a scream trapped in my throat. My flashlight had died, leaving me in complete darkness. The air felt thick, electric, with potential energy. Something scraped against the roof. Not the random pattern of branches, but deliberate movement tracking back and forth. Then a new sound dripping, slow rhythmic drops hitting the floorboards beside my cot. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight. The liquid pooling on the floor glowed with the same blue bioluminescence from my dream. It seeped through the ceiling in a perfect circle directly above where I lay. As I watched, it began to form patterns. Not random splashes, but deliberate shapes that resembled the strange letters I'd seen on the window. My analytical mind desperately sought explanation, bioluminescent fungus, perhaps, or some chemical reaction with rainwater. But I knew with bone-deep certainty that I was witnessing communication. Something intelligent wanted my attention. I backed away from the spreading puddle, retreating to the far corner of the cabin. The liquid continued to drip faster now, the patterns growing more complex in the glow. I noticed something I'd overlooked during my initial inspection of the cabin markings, carved into the floorboards radiating outward from the center of the room. Ancient symbols worn by time. But still visible in the otherworldly light, the cabin wasn't abandoned. It was a waypoint, a meeting place. The dripping stopped abruptly in the sudden silence. I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. The wooden bar across the door sliding slowly open, moved by no human hand. I lunged forward, throwing my weight against the door just as it began to swing inward. Something pushed from the other side, not with the straightforward force of a physical body, but with pulsing pressure that seemed to come from multiple points simultaneously. "What do you want?" I shouted, voice cracking with terror. The pressure ceased so suddenly that I stumbled forward, nearly falling through the partially open door. Through the gap, I saw not the forest clearing, but a luminous blue tunnel stretching impossibly into the distance. At its far end, a figure approached, the same shifting form from my dreams, but now with purpose and direction. I slammed the door shut and fumbled to replace the bar with trembling hands. My phone's flashlight flickered and died, plunging me back into darkness, broken only by the blue glow of the liquid on the floor. The symbols carved into the floorboards now glowed with the same light, creating a perfect circle around me. I recognized with sudden clarity that I had positioned myself exactly where whatever was outside wanted me to be. The knocking resumed, not random now, but a complex rhythm that resonated with the glowing symbols. Each impact sent vibrations through the cabin that I felt in my bones. The air thickened further until breathing became difficult. I closed my eyes, covering my ears to block out the increasingly synchronized pounding that came from all directions at once. But the voice found me anyway, bypassing my physical senses and emerging directly in my mind. "You began the work in another life. The research that bridged worlds, we have kept it safe, protected it, waiting for your pattern to return." Images flashed behind my closed eyelids. A man who both was and wasn't me, working by candlelight at the cabin's table, inscribing the very symbols that now surrounded me. The same man venturing into the forest at night, following lights similar to those I now saw, disappearing into a luminous doorway, promising to return. The doorway weakens the connection, fades. We need your voice to renew the bridge. My scientific mind fought against these impossibilities, but something deeper recognized truth in the images. A fragment of memory not my own, yet somehow familiar, surfaced the knowledge that what waited outside was neither malevolent nor benign, but simply other ancient, patient, and terribly, terribly lonely dawn came with excruciating slowness. As the first gray light filtered through the window, the pounding stopped. The blue glow faded from the symbols and the liquid, which had dried to a crystalline residue. Only then did I realize I had been speaking no chanting words in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. When full daylight finally arrived, I gathered my equipment with shaking hands. Every instinct screamed to flee, to put this place and its impossibilities behind me. Yet the scientist in me, the seeker of knowledge, urged documentation. I photographed the dried residue, the symbols on the floor, the strange tracks outside that now formed a perfect circle around the cabin as I prepared to leave. I noticed my field journal open on the table, strange as I distinctly remembered, packing it in my backpack on a blank page, written in my own handwriting, but with subtle differences in formation, was a message the research continues across lifetimes. You will return when the stars align again. We will wait. I left the cabin and hiked out of the forest without looking back. My mind a battlefield between rational explanations and the undeniable evidence of my experiences. The forest remained ordinary in daylight. No blue glow, no twisted trees, no watching presence, but sometimes in the quietest moments when I'm alone in my university office, I hear it 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced on my door, when I open it. No one is there, and in my dreams a blue pathway opens, leading back to that cabin where something ancient waits patient and persistent for me to finish what I supposedly began. I've canceled my follow-up expedition. I've told colleagues it's due to inconclusive preliminary findings. But the truth is both simpler and more complex. Some doors once noticed can never truly be closed again. And some research once begun continues with or without the researcher's consent. I don't know if I'll ever return to that forest, but increasingly I'm certain the forest has never really left me. The moment I stepped into the Blackwood Hotel, something shifted in the air around me. A heaviness settled over my shoulders, as if the century-old building itself was placing a cold hand upon me. The ornate lobby with its faded crimson carpets and brass fixtures whispered of bygone elegance. But beneath that veneer lay something rotten. I wouldn't recognize this feeling for what it was until later, a primal warning, the ancient part of my brain detecting a predator before my conscious mind could process the danger. I was in Burlington for a 3-day marketing conference, the kind of mandatory corporate event that normally fades from memory the moment you board the plane home. My company had booked rooms at this historic hotel downtown, citing its proximity to the convention center as the primary selling point. What they failed to mention was the building's oppressive atmosphere, the way shadows seemed to linger a beat too long in corners, or how sounds carried strangely through its narrow hallways. After checking in, I noticed him for the first time. He stood by a leather armchair near the antique mailboxes, a bulky figure in a rumpled charcoal suit that hung awkwardly on his frame. The fabric appeared expensive but weathered, as if he'd been wearing it continuously for days. What struck me initially wasn't his disheveled appearance, but his unwavering stare. While other guests milled about in the bustling reception area, his gaze remained fixed on me with unsettling intensity. I averted my eyes, chalking up my discomfort to travel fatigue. The desk clerk handed me my key, an actual metal key attached to a heavy brass number, not the plastic key cards I was accustomed to, and directed me toward the elevators as I wheeled my suitcase across the lobby. The hairs on my neck prickled without turning. I knew he was still watching. The elevator was an antique cage-style contraption with ornate ironwork and manual inner doors that had to be pulled shut as I reached to close them. A thick-fingered hand shot through the gap. My stomach dropped as the rumpled suit man stepped in, standing closer than necessary in the spacious compartment. The doors clanged shut with finality. We ascended in silence, broken only by the mechanical groaning of ancient cables. His cologne, if you could call it that, was an odd mixture of mothballs and something metallic like old pennies. I pretended to check emails on my phone, though reception was non-existent in the elevator shaft from my peripheral vision. I could see him staring, not even pretending to look elsewhere. When I glanced up involuntarily, his lips twitched into what might have been a smile, but never reached his eyes, flat gray and unnaturally still. The elevator indicator showed we were passing the 3rd floor when he finally spoke. Asking which floor I needed, his voice was surprisingly smooth for his rough appearance. With an accent I couldn't place, I replied curtly that I was on the 5th floor, immediately regretting sharing even this small detail. When the elevator shuddered to a stop at 5, he exited ahead of me, despite not pressing any button himself. My chest tightened as he walked down the same corridor, his footsteps eerily synchronized with mine. The hallway stretched before us, narrower than modern building codes would allow, with yellowed sconces casting insufficient light over faded floral wallpaper. Each door we passed made the next seem farther away. The corridor stretching impossibly, my room was at the end. 503 as I approached. He remained just steps behind, fumbling with the key. I felt his presence like a physical weight pressing against my back. Though no part of him touched me, heat radiated from his body in unnatural waves. I managed to slip inside and lock the door in one fluid motion, immediately engaging the deadbolt and chain through the door. I heard his footsteps pause, then slowly retreat. I remained frozen, listening until they faded entirely. Only then did I notice I'd been holding my breath, my shirt damp with sweat despite the room's chill. I told myself I was overreacting. Business travel often brought strange encounters with socially awkward individuals. Perhaps he was just another guest with poor boundaries. The explanation felt hollow, even as I formed it. The room itself did little to ease my growing unease, furnished with heavy Victorian pieces that absorbed rather than reflected the meager light. It featured a four-poster bed with a sagging mattress and windows that opened only partially, as if the building itself was reluctant to allow fresh air into its musty interior. The bathroom fixtures were original to the building. The claw-foot tub and pedestal sink might have been charming in daylight, but took on a more sinister quality in the flickering fluorescent light. Sleep came fitfully that night. The walls seemed to transmit every creak and groan of the old building. Several times I jerked awake, convinced I'd heard my doorknob turning each time I found it secure. Though the sensation of being watched persisted even with the curtains drawn. The next morning, rationality returned with daylight. I attended my conference sessions, networking with colleagues and focusing on work by evening. I had almost convinced myself that stress in an unfamiliar environment had exaggerated a mundane encounter. That illusion shattered. When I returned to the hotel, he was in the lobby again, seated this time, a newspaper held upside down in his hands. His eyes found mine immediately, as if he'd been waiting. The newspaper lowered, revealing that same not-quite smile. My colleagues continued toward the hotel bar, but I made excuses and headed for the elevator, hoping to retreat to my room as the elevator doors began to close. A familiar hand slid through the gap. My heart hammered against my ribs as he entered. Nodding as if we were old acquaintances this time, he didn't ask my floor, but pressed 5 himself. The ascending journey felt interminable. Sweat beaded at my temples. Despite the building's persistent chill, he positioned himself differently this time, directly beside me rather than behind, and spoke in that unnervingly smooth voice. He asked if I was enjoying my stay, if I found the hotel's history interesting. I gave non-committal responses, struggling to maintain composure. Then he mentioned something that sent ice through my veins. He knew I'd been at the Harrington presentation that afternoon. I hadn't mentioned the conference to him, let alone specific sessions. When the doors opened at 5, he gestured for me to exit. First, every instinct screamed to stay in the elevator to ride back down to the populated lobby, but fear of confrontation propelled me forward again. He followed this time. As we walked the narrow corridor, he asked if I might be interested in discussing certain opportunities that could benefit someone with my expertise. His phrasing was vague, cloaked in corporate jargon, but underlying it was something predatory at my door. I declined firmly and hurried inside, engaging all locks through the peephole. I watched him linger, staring at my door, for nearly 5 minutes before departing. That night I researched the hotel's history on my laptop. The Blackwood had stood since 1898, surviving fire, economic downturns, and numerous renovation attempts. Several pages mentioned its supposedly haunted reputation. Standard fare for marketing historic properties. What caught my attention was a small article from 1976 describing how a traveling salesman had disappeared after last being seen at the hotel. The piece mentioned police suspicion of an unidentified business associate who had allegedly been seen following the victim's sleep was impossible. After that, I pushed a heavy dresser against the door and kept the bathroom light on somewhere around 3 a.m. I heard shuffling in the hallway that stopped directly outside my room. The door knob turned gently, testing the lock. When it held, a soft, scratching sound began as if someone was running their fingernails lightly across the wood. It continued for several minutes before fading away. The third day of the conference passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I kept seeing figures in rumpled suits at the periphery of my vision. Twice I excused myself from sessions to call the hotel's front desk inquiring about their security procedures and whether they could tell me anything about other guests on my floor. The clerk sounded puzzled, then concerned, eventually informing me that due to privacy policies, they couldn't discuss other guests, but that security could escort me to my room if needed. I declined the escort, not wanting to appear irrational to colleagues, but decided to return to the hotel earlier than planned. Perhaps confronting this situation in daylight would dispel some of its power over me. That decision proved catastrophic. The hotel corridor was deserted when I exited the elevator. At 5, relief washed over me until I rounded the corner to the wing containing my room. There he stood, leaning casually against the wall beside my door, as if he belonged there. The corridor suddenly seemed both endless and confining. The walls pressing inward, my feet felt lean, each step requiring conscious effort when he saw me. That familiar, not quite smile spread across his face. His eyes, which I now noticed had an unusual reflective quality in certain light fixed on mine. He straightened his posture but didn't move from his position, blocking access to my door. For the first time, I noticed something else. No one else ever seemed to acknowledge his presence. No staff greeted him. No other guests nodded in passing. He existed in a bubble of isolation that now threatened to envelop me as well. He asked if I was finally ready to talk, his tone suggesting we had an appointment I'd been avoiding. My mouth went dry, pulse throbbing visibly in my wrists. I refused, attempting to move past him toward my door. He shifted slightly, not explicitly blocking me, but positioning himself so I would have to brush against him to pass. I chose retreat instead, backing away while maintaining eye contact, unwilling to turn my back on him. His expression didn't change as I retreated, but something flickered in those flat gray eyes. Something ancient and hungry that had nothing to do with business opportunities. I spent that night in the hotel bar, remaining in public spaces, until exhaustion overtook fear. When I finally returned to my room well after midnight, the corridor was mercifully empty inside. However, something felt different. The air held a faint trace of that mothball and metal scent. The dresser I'd pushed against the door had been moved back to its original position. Nothing was missing but several items. My toiletry bag, conference materials, even my pajamas had been rearranged just enough to notice I didn't sleep at first light. I packed my bags and went to the front desk to check out a day early. The clerk seemed unsurprised by my request, but paused while processing it. She mentioned something odd according to their records. I'd been upgraded to my room at the request of another guest, a business associate, who had called ahead when I pressed for details. She checked the system again and appeared confused, saying she couldn't find any record of who had authorized the upgrade. As I waited for my receipt, a chill washed over me in the reflection of the brass bell on the counter. I saw him watching from the same spot by the mailboxes when I turned. He raised his hand in a mocking salute. Outside, the taxi driver loaded my luggage while I kept glancing back at the hotel entrance as we pulled away. I looked up at the 5th floor from the street there. In the window of room 503 stood a familiar silhouette. Impossible, since I just surrendered my key. More disturbing was the room adjacent to mine, where an identical figure stood in the window. Then a third appeared in another window, and a fourth. The taxi turned the corner. Breaking my line of sight, I never returned to Burlington, and I changed careers 6 months later, sometimes in crowded places, airports, shopping malls, conference centers. I catch a glimpse of a rumpled suit in my peripheral vision, and in my dreams, endless hotel corridors stretch before me, each door opening to reveal the same smiling figure, patiently waiting for me to be ready to talk. I know someday I'll run out of places to hide, and on that day, I suspect I'll finally learn what he's been so eager to discuss the first time I heard the scratching. I convinced myself it was just the old oak branches scraping against the roof. The second time, I blamed raccoons or squirrels that had found their way inside. By the third time, when the scratching transformed into a slow, deliberate dragging sound. Directly above my bedroom ceiling, I could no longer deny that something was living in my attic. Something that seemed to grow more restless with each passing full moon. I inherited this colonial-style house from my uncle 6 months ago. The property sits isolated at the end of a winding rural road, surrounded by dense woods that seem to devour the sunlight. Even on the brightest days, the realtor had casually mentioned that my uncle spent his final years as a recluse, refusing visitors and becoming increasingly paranoid. I should have paid more attention to the way her smile never reached her eyes when she handed me the keys, or how she hurriedly mentioned that the attic had been permanently sealed. For structural reasons, the first full moon after I moved in passed without incident. I was too busy unpacking, arranging furniture, and adapting to my new remote work setup to notice anything unusual. The house creaked and settled as old houses do, and I attributed the occasional odd sound to unfamiliar acoustics. It wasn't until the hibernate second full moon that the pattern began to emerge that night. I woke suddenly at 3:17 a.m., the digital clock's red numbers burning in the darkness. The scratching above me was methodical, 3 quick scrapes followed by a pause. Then repeated, I grabbed my phone and recorded the sound, playing it back in the morning light. To confirm it wasn't just a dream, the recording captured it perfectly. Scrape, 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 pause, scrape, scrape, scrape. When I checked the astronomical calendar online later that day, I discovered it had been a full moon by the third full moon. The scratching had evolved. Now it sounded like something heavy being dragged across the attic floor, directly above my bedroom. The noise would start around midnight and continue intermittently until dawn. But something else had changed too. A smell began to permeate the house, faint at first, but growing stronger as the night progressed. It was an odor I couldn't quite identify, like wet soil mixed with something metallic and organic, reminiscent of blood but earthier, more primal. I spent that entire night wide awake, my heart hammering against my ribs, as the dragging sounds traced what seemed to be deliberate patterns overhead. When morning finally arrived, the noises ceased and the smell gradually dissipated until it was just a memory that made me question my own senses. During daylight hours, rationality returned. I researched local wildlife that might have nested in my attic: raccoons, opossums, even larger animals like foxes that might seek shelter. None of the descriptions matched what I was experiencing. Most nocturnal animals don't synchronize their activities with lunar cycles, and none would explain the distinct odor that seemed to seep through the ceiling. It took me 2 more weeks to gather enough courage to investigate. I found the attic access in the hallway ceiling, a hinged trap door sealed with multiple layers of paint, and what appeared to be construction adhesive around its edges. The effort put into sealing, it seemed excessive for structural reasons, using a utility knife. I carefully cut through the layers of paint and adhesive. My palms were slick with sweat, and my breathing had become shallow as I worked, when the blade finally breached the seal. A whisper of that same earthy, metallic odor escaped through the crack, making my stomach clench. I froze, utility knife suspended in midair, as a wave of irrational panic washed over me. For several minutes, I stood motionless on the stepladder, listening intently for any sound from above. There was only silence pushing past my hesitation. I finished cutting through the seal and pushed the trap door open. The hinges protested with a screech that seemed unnaturally loud. In the quiet house, a rush of stale air descended, carrying dust particles that danced in the beam of my flashlight. I steeled myself and climbed into the darkness. The attic stretched the length of the house, with rough wooden floorboards and exposed rafters. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating decades of dust, except for one alarming detail. A clear path had been worn through the dust, as if something regularly moved from one end of the attic to the other. The path wasn't random. It formed a precise pattern that reminded me of the ritualistic movements I'd heard on full moon nights. As I followed the path with my light, my breath caught in my throat. There, gouged into the wooden floorboards, were deep scratch marks. They weren't the random scratchings of an animal seeking entry or exit. These marks were deliberate 4 parallel lines repeating at regular intervals along the path, each groove at least half an inch deep in the hardwood. Whatever made these marks possessed strength no woodland creature could muster. I knelt to examine the scratches more closely, running my fingers along the grooves. The wood around the marks felt unusually cold, as if it had absorbed some lingering chill that defied the stuffy attic heat. My fingertips tingled unpleasantly where they touched the gouges, and I jerked my hand back, wiping it instinctively against my jeans. A thorough search of the attic revealed no obvious entry points, no damaged vents, no gaps in the roof line. No broken windows. Whatever moved up here didn't seem to come from outside. Yet something was clearly accessing this sealed space in the farthest corner, partially hidden behind an old steamer trunk. I discovered a peculiar arrangement of small objects. At first I thought they were just debris, but as I moved closer, my flashlight revealed their deliberate placement. Twigs, bits of bone, small stones, and dried plants had been arranged in a perfect circle about 2 feet in diameter. In the center of the circle lay a small pouch made of what appeared to be leather discolored with age and tied with sinew. Every instinct screamed at me not to touch it. Yet I found myself reaching for the pouch, drawn by a curiosity that overwhelmed my fear. The leather felt unnaturally warm against my skin, pulsing slightly as if something inside was alive. I pulled the drawstring open and tilted the contents into my palm. A single tooth yellowed with age but unmistakably human, and a small piece of paper with strange symbols, written in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The discovery sent me scrambling back down the ladder, heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. I slammed the trapdoor shut and spent the remainder of the day researching local legends, folklore, and the history of the property. The County Historical Society had little information, except that the land had once belonged to a reclusive naturalist in the late 1800s, who was rumored to conduct unorthodox experiments involving lunar cycles and their effects on animal behavior. My uncle, I learned, had acquired the property in the 1970s after it had stood abandoned for nearly 2 decades, according to the few locals willing to discuss it. He had been a normal, sociable person until about 15 years ago, when he suddenly cut ties with friends and began covering all his windows. During full moons that night, I scoured online forums dedicated to paranormal phenomena and occult practices. One obscure thread caught my attention, a discussion about lunar parasites, entities that supposedly exist in a state between corporeality and energy, manifesting strongest during full moons when they feed on the heightened electromagnetic fields generated by living organisms. The description matched my experiences too closely to dismiss as coincidence. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing for the upcoming full moon. I installed motion-activated cameras in the attic and placed sound recorders at strategic locations. I researched protective measures mentioned in the online forums, lines of salt at thresholds, specific herbs known to repel negative entities, symbols of protection drawn in chalk. Half of me felt ridiculous taking these measures. The other half remembered the deep gouges in solid hardwood and the strange arrangement of objects in the circle. When the full moon finally arrived, I was ready, or so I thought. I sat in my makeshift command center in the spare bedroom, surrounded by monitors connected to the cameras. The local weather forecast had predicted cloudy skies, but as evening approached, the clouds dispersed as if deliberately making way for the moon's ascent. The first hours passed uneventfully. The monitors showed nothing but the still, dust-filled attic. Then as the moon reached its zenith around midnight, the temperature in the house plummeted. My breath formed visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The familiar odor returned stronger than ever, seeping into every corner of the house. On the monitors, I watched in horror as the dust on the attic floor began to swirl, forming a vortex at the center of the ritual circle. I discovered the cameras flickered, their digital displays distorting, as if affected by some powerful electromagnetic field. Then one by one they went dark. The scratching began no longer above me, but throughout the house, as if whatever dwelled in the attic had expanded its territory. The sound emanated from inside the walls under the floorboards, even from within the heating vents. My ears popped painfully as the air pressure in the house changed, becoming dense and difficult to breathe. I tried calling for help, but my phone showed no service when I attempted to leave through the front door. The knob turned red hot in my grasp, searing my palm and sending me reeling back in pain. Every window had fogged over with a thick, viscous condensation that no amount of wiping would clear. As I stood in the hallway, paralyzed with indecision, the trap door to the attic slowly opened by itself. No creaking hinges this time, just a silent, deliberate movement that defied physics. From the dark, rectangular opening, that fetid odor poured down like a waterfall of invisible miasma. Time seemed to distort as I watched the darkness at the opening. At first I saw nothing, but as my eyes adjusted, I detected movement, not a solid form, but a rippling disturbance in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The disturbance expanded, flowing down from the attic. Like liquid shadow, my legs gave way, and I collapsed against the wall, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The rippling darkness approached, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that seemed to freeze the marrow in my bones as it drew nearer. I began to discern a pattern within the distortion, something almost like a face. If a face could be composed of constantly shifting smoke and shadow, what happened next remains fragmented in my memory. I recall running to my uncle's study, driven by some instinct. I couldn't explain. The room had remained largely as he left it, with bookshelves lining the walls and his old desk dominating the center as the temperature continued to drop and the scratching sounds converged on the study door. I frantically searched the desk drawers. In the bottom drawer, I found a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my uncle's increasingly erratic handwriting. Flipping through it desperately, I found an entry dated exactly 15 years ago during a full moon. My uncle had described discovering the same ritual circle I had found, but he had gone further. He had completed the ritual thinking it would grant him communion with natural energies. Instead, it had created a bridge, a doorway, for something that existed in the spaces between dimensions. The final pages contained his desperate solution, a counter-ritual that would bind the entity to the attic, preventing it from fully manifesting. He had performed this binding during each full moon, sacrificing his own blood to strengthen the seal with his death. The binding had weakened with each lunar cycle as the study door began to bulge inward, the wood splintering under invisible pressure. I cut my palm with a letter opener and hurriedly performed the ritual described in the final pages. The words felt foreign on my tongue, ancient syllables that seemed to vibrate with their own power. The effect was immediate. The pressure in the room reversed, creating a vacuum that pulled the shadows back toward the attic. The temperature rose rapidly and the scratching sounds receded. I followed the retreating entity, my bleeding hand extended before me, continuing the chant as I forced it back up through the trap door. When it was finally contained, I collapsed on the hallway floor, exhausted beyond measure. According to my uncle's journal, the binding would hold until the next full moon, when I would need to renew it. That was 4 lunar cycles ago each month. As the full moon approaches, I prepare the ritual components each month. The entity tests the boundaries of its prison, growing stronger, more intelligent in its attempts to break free. Sometimes I hear it speaking not in words, but in impressions that form thoughts in my mind. It makes promises, offers knowledge and power, beyond human understanding. Last month it showed me visions of what it could help me become. The images were seductive, offering evolution beyond my mortal form. For a moment I considered accepting its offer, wondering if my uncle had originally intended to merge with it before losing his nerve. I now understand why my uncle became a recluse. This house cannot be abandoned. The binding is connected to the bloodline that performed it. If I leave, the entity will break free, seeking the one who imprisoned it, so I remain a jailer in my inherited prison. Tomorrow night brings another full moon. The scratch marks on the attic floor have begun to glow with a faint blue luminescence. The odor has started seeping through earlier than in previous months. I found new symbols carved into the undersides of furniture, appearing when I'm not looking. I fear the binding is weakening, or perhaps the entity is evolving, finding new ways to influence our world sometimes. When I look in the mirror, I notice my eyes reflecting light, oddly, like an animal's in the dark. My teeth ache constantly, as if shifting in my gums. And lately, I've been wondering why I continue to fight. It would communion with such an entity be so terrible? My uncle feared it, but perhaps he lacked vision. Perhaps this is evolution. Calling tonight as the moon rises, I will ascend to the attic once more. Whether I go as jailer or supplicant, I have not yet decided.